What if I told you that somewhere in the remote corners of Utah, there exists a place so terrifying that even hardened government agents refuse to discuss it? A place where the laws of physics seem negotiable, where reality bends and twists like smoke in the wind, and where people simply disappear. Tonight's story comes from recovered audio recordings and testimonies that were never meant to see the light of day. Before we dive in, make sure to leave your video ideas in the comments below, and a huge thank you to Spot Boogie and Sincerely Something Strange for inspiring this chilling tale. If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories for more content that will haunt your dreams. The recording you're about to hear was found 3 months after freelance surveyor Jake Morrison vanished without a trace near Fort Duchesne, Utah. What started as a routine mapping job became something far more sinister. A journey into a realm where the impossible becomes inevitable, and where curiosity can cost you everything. This is his story, told through his own words, recovered from devices that shouldn't have survived what they witnessed. My name is Jake Morrison, and I'm what you'd call a professional wanderer. For the past 8 years, I've made my living as a freelance surveyor and land researcher, taking contracts from property developers, environmental agencies, and occasionally private clients with more money than sense. The work takes me to some pretty remote places, abandoned mining claims, disputed property lines, forgotten corners of the American West where civilization is just a rumour carried on the wind. I've always prided myself on being practical, grounded. I deal in facts, coordinates, measurements, topographical realities. I don't believe in ghost stories or urban legends, or at least I didn't. Not until that scorching Tuesday in July when I took what I thought would be just another routine mapping job. The client was a development company looking to assess some acreage near the Uinta Basin for potential commercial use. Nothing fancy, just needed someone to verify boundary markers and document any structures or natural features that might affect future construction. Easy money, or so I thought. I'd been driving the back roads near Fort Duchesne for about 3 hours, my truck's air conditioning fighting a losing battle against the brutal Utah sun. The landscape out here is unforgiving. Red rocks jutting up like broken teeth, scrubland that stretches to the horizon, and a silence so complete it makes your ears ring. It's the kind of place where you can drive for miles without seeing another soul, where the weight of isolation settles on you like dust. I was following my GPS toward what should have been the northeastern boundary of the survey area, when I noticed something odd. The paved road had given way to gravel, then dirt, and now I was bouncing along what could generously be called a trail. My GPS insisted I was still on the right track, but something felt wrong. The landscape had changed subtly. The usual markers I used for navigation seemed off somehow. That's when I saw the first sign. It wasn't like the typical no trespassing signs you'd expect on ranch property. This one was different, sleek, professional, with text that made my stomach tighten. Restricted area, authorised personnel only, violators subject to prosecution under federal law. Below that, in smaller text, was an agency code I didn't recognise. NIDS-DOD-001. I pulled my truck to a stop and checked my coordinates again. According to my GPS, I was still within the survey boundaries, but that sign suggested otherwise. I figured it was probably just rancher paranoia, some property owner trying to scare off trespassers with official-looking signage. Lord knows I'd encountered enough of that in my line of work. But as I sat there, engine idling, something else caught my attention. Lights. Not the steady glow of electric bulbs or the harsh beam of spotlights, but something else entirely. They flickered low across the fields ahead, maybe half a mile away, dancing and weaving in patterns that didn't match any aircraft I knew. They weren't quite white, weren't quite blue, somewhere in between, like the colour of lightning just before it strikes. I watched those lights for maybe 10 minutes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. They moved too deliberately to be natural phenomena, too erratically to be conventional aircraft. Sometimes they cluster together, forming geometric patterns, then scatter like startled birds. Other times they'd simply vanish, only to reappear seconds later in a completely different location. Curiosity got the better of common sense. I put the truck in gear and continued down the trail, reasoning that if I was truly trespassing, someone would be along shortly to escort me out. The lights seemed to be coming from behind a low ridge up ahead, and I found myself drawn toward them like a moth to flame. As I crested the ridge, the landscape opened up into a wide valley, and what I saw there made me question everything I thought I knew about the Utah desert. Chapter 1. First Contact with the Ranch. The valley below was unlike anything I'd encountered in 8 years of surveying remote properties, where I expected to see typical ranch infrastructure, maybe a farmhouse, some outbuildings, cattle pens. Instead, I found something that looked more like a military installation disguised as rural property. Chain-link fencing ran for miles in every direction, topped with razor wire and sporting cameras every 100 yards or so. Not the simple game cameras you'd see on hunting property, but sophisticated units with multiple lenses and communication arrays. The kind of equipment that cost more than most people's cars. I parked at the edge of the fencing and stepped out into the oppressive heat. The silence here was different than the natural quiet of the desert. It felt imposed, artificial, as if sound itself was being dampened by some unseen force. Even the usual buzz of insects was absent. As I approached the fence line, that's when I heard it. A sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Radio static, but not coming from any device I could see. It seemed to bleed directly from the air around me, ebbing and flowing like electronic tides. Sometimes it would resolve into almost voices, whispered words in languages I couldn't identify, before dissolving back into white noise. I pulled out my phone to record the phenomenon, but the screen showed no signal bars and the camera app kept crashing. Every electronic device I carried, GPS unit, digital camera, even my wristwatch, was acting erratically. That's when I saw the creature. It was standing maybe 50 yards away near a cattle pen that appeared to be empty. At first glance it looked like a wolf, large, dark-furred, moving with predatory grace. But as I watched I realised the proportions were all wrong. It was too big, easily the size of a small horse, and its movements were too fluid, too intelligent. When it turned to look at me, its eyes didn't reflect red like a normal animal's would. They glowed amber, like signal lights piercing fog. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. The creature's gaze was unsettlingly human, filled with an intelligence that seemed to assess and judge. There was recognition there, as if it knew exactly what I was and found me wanting. Then it did something that shattered my rational worldview entirely. It stood up on its hind legs, easily 8 feet tall, and raised what I can only describe as a hand, though it was still distinctly paw-like in what almost seemed like a greeting, or a warning. I ran. I'm not proud of it, but every instinct I possess screamed at me to get as far away from that place as possible. I sprinted back to my truck, fumbled with the keys, and gunned the engine. As I spun the wheel and hit the accelerator, I caught a glimpse in my rearview mirror of more shapes emerging from the shadows near the fence line. They moved with the same impossible grace, watching my retreat with those amber eyes. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel, but muscle memory kicked in, and I somehow managed to navigate back to the main road. It wasn't until I was 20 miles away, sitting in the parking lot of a gas station in Roosevelt, that I finally felt like I could breathe again. But even as I sat there trying to process what I'd witnessed, I knew I couldn't just walk away. I'm a surveyor. Documentation is what I do. And despite every rational voice in my head telling me to forget what I'd seen and find another line of work, I pulled out my GPS unit and saved the coordinates. Whatever that place was, whatever I'd encountered there, I needed proof. The world needed to know. Chapter 2. Trying to Tell the World. The first thing I did when I got home to Salt Lake City was hit the internet. I spent hours searching for any information about restricted government property near Fort Duchesne, but came up empty. Official maps showed only private ranch land and some Bureau of Land Management territory. No military installations, no research facilities, Nothing that would explain the sophisticated security I'd witnessed. That's when I remembered the agency code from the sign, NIDS-DOD-001. A search for NIDS led me down a rabbit hole that made my encounter seem even more disturbing. The National Institute for Discovery Science, a private research organisation that had been studying anomalous phenomena for decades before apparently going dark in the early 2000s. Department of Defence involvement suggested whatever was happening at that ranch had government backing at the highest levels. I decided to share my experience online, hoping someone else might have similar encounters or additional information. I chose Reddit, figuring the anonymity would protect me while still getting the story out there. My post was simple and straightforward. Strange encounter at restricted property near Fort Duchesne, Utah. Saw unidentified lights, advanced surveillance equipment, and what I can only describe as an unusually large wolf-like creature with glowing eyes. Location appears to be some kind of government research facility disguised as ranch property. Anyone else have experiences in this area? The response was immediate and overwhelmingly dismissive. Another Skinwalker Ranch copycat story, read the top comment. At least try to be original if you're going to make stuff up. This is literally just the plot of every paranormal TV show about Utah, wrote another user. Next you'll be telling us about cattle mutilations and alien abductions. Why do people think they can just rehash old urban legends and pass them off as real experiences? The criticism kept coming, each comment more sceptical than the last. I tried to explain that I'd never heard of Skinwalker Ranch before my encounter, that I was a professional surveyor with 8 years of field experience, that I had no reason to fabricate such a story. But the more I protested, the more convinced people became that I was either lying or delusional. Frustrated, I took my story to other forums, paranormal investigation sites, UFO communities, even local Utah message boards. Everywhere I posted, the response was the same. Accusations of hoaxing, demands for proof I didn't have, and dismissive comparisons to existing folklore. One user on a paranormal forum put it particularly bluntly. Skinwalker Ranch stories have been circulating for decades. Native American legends, government conspiracies, shape-shifting creatures, it's all been done to death. If you really experience something there, you're either the unluckiest person alive to stumble onto the most documented paranormal hotspot in America, or you're just another attention seeker spinning tall tales. The worst part was, they weren't entirely wrong. As I researched more about this Skinwalker Ranch, I discovered that the area had been the subject of intense scrutiny for years. Stories of strange lights, impossible creatures and government cover-ups were practically cliché in paranormal circles. My genuine experience had been absorbed into a mythology so pervasive that the truth was indistinguishable from fiction. I tried traditional media next, reaching out to local newspapers and television stations. The response was universally negative. Skinwalker Ranch is just a tourist hoax, the editor of a Uinta Basin weekly told me over the phone. We get calls about this stuff all the time. People see a coyote in poor lighting conditions and suddenly it's an 8-foot shapeshifter. Trust me, son, there's nothing supernatural happening out there. But I saw the government installations, I insisted. The surveillance equipment, the restricted signage. Private property owners have every right to secure their land, he interrupted. Doesn't make it a conspiracy. 3 weeks after my encounter, I was no closer to being believed than when I started. If anything, my attempts to share the truth had only convinced people I was either mentally unstable or deliberately deceptive. The rational part of my brain began to wonder if maybe they were right. Maybe the heat and isolation had gotten to me. Maybe what I'd seen was just a large dog and some reflected light from distant ranch buildings. But every night when I closed my eyes I saw those amber orbs staring back at me, filled with impossible intelligence, and I knew, regardless of what anyone else believed, that I had to go back. I needed proof. Chapter 3. The Return Expedition. Planning my return trip took 2 weeks of careful preparation. If I was going to convince anyone of what I'd witnessed, I needed documentation that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. I invested in equipment I couldn't really afford. A high-definition handheld video camera with night vision capabilities, professional-grade audio recording equipment, and, thanks to a favour from my college roommate who worked in environmental consulting, a Geiger counter for detecting radiation anomalies. I also did something I'd never done before. I prepared detailed backup plans. I left sealed envelopes with my apartment manager and my sister, containing maps of my intended destination and instructions to contact authorities if I didn't return within 48 hours. Looking back, it seems almost prescient how thoroughly I planned for the possibility that something might happen to me. The drive back to the Uinta Basin felt different this time. Where my first trip had been motivated by simple curiosity and professional obligation, this journey carried the weight of obsession. I found myself checking and rechecking my equipment, rehearsing the questions I'd ask if I encountered anyone at the property, practicing steady camera techniques while driving. I arrived at the access road near dusk, timing my approach for maximum visual documentation. The desert sunset painted everything in shades of orange and red, creating perfect lighting conditions for video. I parked at the same spot as before and began setting up my equipment, speaking into the audio recorder to establish a timestamp. This is Jake Morrison, freelance surveyor, returning to coordinates 40.2, 553 north, 109.8914 west. Date: August 15th. Time: 7:42 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. Purpose of visit: documentation of anomalous phenomena previously observed at this location. My voice sounded steady on the recording, professional, but I remember my hands shaking as I adjusted the camera settings. The strange phenomena began immediately. As I drove up the dirt trail toward the ridge where I'd first seen the lights, my truck's electrical system began acting erratically. The radio cycled through stations randomly, picking up fragments of conversation in languages I couldn't identify. The headlights flickered, and the engine developed a rough idle that hadn't been there during the drive from Salt Lake City. Halfway up the trail, the truck died completely. Vehicle experiencing total electrical failure, I recorded, trying to keep the concern out of my voice. All dashboard lights dark, engine won't turn over, attempting to continue on foot. I gathered my equipment and started walking, following the beam of my flashlight up the increasingly steep path. That's when I noticed the compass acting strangely. Instead of pointing steadily north, the needle was rotating slowly, completing a full revolution every 30 seconds or so. I tried tapping the case, thinking it might be a mechanical issue, but the rotation continued with metronomic precision. The audio recorder was picking up interference even before I reached the fenced property. Static bursts interrupted my commentary, sometimes resolving into what sounded like distant voices or mechanical humming. When I played the audio back later, I could swear some of those voices were saying my name. As I crested the ridge and looked down into the valley, I saw that the lights were active again. But this time, they seemed to be responding to my presence. Instead of the random patterns I'd observed during my first visit, they now moved in formations that appeared almost welcoming. Gentle sweeping motions like someone waving with a flashlight. Unidentified light sources are active and appear to be exhibiting responsive behaviour, I whispered into the recorder, beginning descent into valley for closer observation. The closer I got to the fence perimeter, the more agitated my equipment became. The Geiger counter, which had been silent during the drive, began clicking intermittently. The video camera's display showed strange artifacts, geometric shapes that flickered at the edges of the frame, shadows that moved independently of any visible objects. I found the same broken section of fencing I'd noticed during my first visit and slipped through, officially trespassing on property that might have been the most closely guarded secret in the American West. The moment I crossed the fence line, everything changed. The desert silence was replaced by a low humming, like the sound of high-voltage power lines but deeper, more resonant. The air itself felt different, thicker somehow, as if the atmosphere had been replaced with something heavier than normal oxygen. When I breathed, it was like inhaling liquid that happened to be gaseous. Have crossed onto restricted property, I recorded, experiencing unusual atmospheric conditions, equipment showing increased anomalous readings. That's when I heard the footsteps, not human footsteps, too heavy, too deliberate, and moving in a rhythm that didn't match bipedal locomotion. They seemed to be circling me, staying just outside the range of my flashlight. I swept the beam in wide arcs, trying to locate the source, but caught only glimpses of movement at the edge of the light's reach. "Something's moving out there," I whispered into the recorder. "Multiple contacts, possibly the same type of entity I observed during my previous visit." The Geiger counter's clicking accelerated, then stopped entirely. When I checked the display, it showed error messages I'd never seen before, symbols that didn't correspond to any standard radiation detection protocol. That's when the lights began moving toward me. Chapter 4. Things escalate. What happened next challenges every assumption I'd made about the nature of reality. The lights I'd been observing from a distance weren't attached to any physical object I could identify. They moved through the air with liquid grace, occasionally passing through solid objects, fence posts, equipment, even what appeared to be abandoned vehicles scattered around the property, without any apparent impediment. As they approached, I could see they weren't simply sources of illumination. Each light was contained within what looked like a sphere of distorted air, like heat shimmer given form and purpose. They pulsed with internal rhythms that seemed almost biological, expanding and contracting like slow heartbeats made of pure energy. I raised my video camera and began recording, though what I captured bore little resemblance to what I was actually seeing. The screen showed fragmentary images, flashes of light against darkness, geometric patterns that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space, and occasionally shapes that might have been structures but defied architectural logic. "Camera is malfunctioning," I whispered into the audio recorder. "Visual distortion consistent with electromagnetic interference, but phenomena are clearly visible to naked eye." One of the light spheres moved to within 10 feet of me, hovering at eye level. This close, I could see movement within the luminous core, patterns that suggested intelligence, purpose, maybe even curiosity. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Then it spoke to me, not in words, not in any language I recognized, but directly into my consciousness. Images flooded my mind. Vast underground complexes, laboratories filled with technology decades ahead of anything publicly acknowledged, and creatures that defied every category of known biology. I saw myself as the light saw me, a small, fragile figure stumbling through forces beyond his comprehension. And I understood that I was not the first to make this journey. The vision showed me others like myself, researchers, investigators, curious wanderers who had discovered this place and attempted to document its secrets. Some had been turned away by subtle manipulations of their equipment or psychological pressure that convinced them to leave. Others, those who persisted, had simply disappeared. The light sphere pulsed brighter, and I felt a warning settle into my bones. This was my opportunity to join the former group. Turn around, walk away, forget what I'd seen, and live a normal life. The alternative was to become another unexplained disappearance in the Utah desert. I should have taken the warning. Instead, I found myself moving deeper into the property, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't explain. The cattle pens I'd seen from a distance were completely empty, but the stench of blood hung heavy in the air. Not the metallic smell of fresh injury, but something older, more pervasive, as if the very ground was saturated with decades of violence. The audio recorder captured sounds I hadn't noticed in real time, whispered conversations in the distance, mechanical humming that seemed to emanate from underground, and occasionally something that might have been screaming from a very great depth. Near what appeared to be the main ranch buildings, structures that looked normal from a distance but revealed impossible architectural details up close, I encountered more of the wolf-like creatures I'd seen during my first visit. They moved in a pack, coordinating their movements with the efficiency of trained soldiers, but these weren't animals in any conventional sense. As they approached, their forms began to shift. The wolf-like appearance dissolved like smoke, revealing something underneath that my mind couldn't properly process. They were simultaneously organic and mechanical, familiar and utterly alien. The amber glow of their eyes intensified, and I realized they were scanning me, downloading information about my presence, my equipment, my intentions. One of them, the largest, apparently the pack leader, approached to within arm's reach. When it spoke, The words bypassed my ears entirely and appeared directly in my consciousness, the same way the light sphere had communicated. "You should not have returned," the voice said, carrying undertones of regret rather than threat. "This place is not meant for your kind to understand." "I need proof," I managed to say aloud, though my voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "People need to know what's happening here." "Knowledge of this place has a price," the creature replied. "Are you prepared to pay it?" Before I could respond, the world around me erupted into chaos. The Geiger counter, which had been silent since entering the property, suddenly began clicking so rapidly it sounded like sustained machine gun fire. The video camera's screen filled with images that couldn't possibly be real. Vast underground chambers, beings that combined human and animal characteristics in ways that violated basic biology, and technology that seemed to bend space and time around itself. Then, abruptly, everything went dark. The lights vanished, the creatures melted back into shadows, and I found myself alone in the desert night with nothing but the beam of my flashlight to hold back the overwhelming darkness. But the silence was wrong, too complete, as if the entire valley had been placed under a dome of absolute quiet. I ran toward where I thought the fence line should be, stumbling over terrain that seemed to shift beneath my feet. The compass spun wildly, offering no guidance. The GPS unit showed error messages in languages that weren't human. Even my watch had stopped, its digital display frozen at the exact moment the chaos had begun. When I finally found the break in the fence and stumbled through to the other side, the desert night reasserted its normal sounds. Wind through scrub brush, the distant call of a coyote, the whisper of sand against stone. But I knew I was forever changed by what I'd witnessed beyond that fence. I made it back to my truck, which started immediately as if it had never experienced any problems at all. As I drove away from that cursed place, I spoke one final entry into my audio recorder. "Whatever's happening at that ranch, it's beyond government conspiracy or natural phenomena. This is something else entirely. Something that exists at the intersection of science and nightmare." I should have stopped there. Should have gone home, destroyed the recordings, and tried to forget everything I'd seen. But obsession is a powerful drug, and I was already too far gone to quit. Chapter 5. The Final Transmission. 3 days after my second encounter at the ranch, I knew I had to go back one more time. The partial recordings I'd captured were intriguing but ultimately inconclusive, too fragmentary and distorted to convince skeptics. What I needed was sustained documentation of the phenomena, something that couldn't be dismissed as equipment malfunction or environmental factors. I upgraded my recording equipment again, investing in military surplus night vision technology and electromagnetic shielding for my devices. If the ranch's effects were based on electromagnetic interference, I reasoned, proper shielding might allow me to capture clearer evidence. This time I approached the property from a different angle, hiking cross-country from a point several miles south of my previous entry routes. I wanted to avoid any surveillance systems that might have been alerted by my earlier visits. The hike took most of the afternoon, and I timed my arrival for just after sunset. The transition from day to night in the desert is abrupt and absolute. One moment you can see for miles, the next you're surrounded by darkness so complete it seems solid. I established the observation post on a rise overlooking the valley, approximately half a mile from the ranch facilities. From this distance, I could document the phenomena while maintaining some margin of safety, or so I thought. My final audio log began at 8:47 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. This is Jake Morrison, beginning what I expect to be my final investigation of the anomalous phenomena at coordinates 40.2553 north, 109.8914 west. I'm positioned approximately 800 metres southeast of the primary facility, with clear lines of sight to all previously observed activity areas. The night vision equipment revealed details I'd missed during my earlier visits. The ranch wasn't a single installation, but rather a complex of interconnected facilities, some above ground, others clearly extending deep underground. Ventilation shafts and access points were scattered across the valley floor, suggesting a subterranean network of extraordinary scope. Visual observation indicates this facility is significantly larger than initially assessed, I continued recording. Underground component appears extensive, possibly covering several square miles. That's when the lights began their nightly dance, but this time I was prepared. The electromagnetic shielding around my recording equipment seemed to be working. The video camera maintained stable operation, and the audio remained clear despite the usual electromagnetic interference that plagued the area. For the first hour, everything proceeded normally. The lights performed their usual patterns, the creatures moved through the shadows with their characteristic fluid grace, and I documented everything with scientific detachment. I was finally getting the evidence I needed. Then something changed. The patterns of light began to shift, forming configurations I hadn't seen before. Instead of random movements or simple geometric forms, they started arranging themselves into complex symbols, mathematical formulae, star charts, what looked like technical diagrams for devices I couldn't identify. The luminous phenomena are exhibiting structured information patterns, I whispered into the recorder. This appears to be intentional communication rather than random manifestation. As I watched through the night vision scope, the symbols became more complex, more urgent. I realized I was witnessing some kind of message, though I couldn't begin to interpret its meaning. The lights pulsed in synchronized sequences, creating three-dimensional holographic displays that hung in the air like luminous blueprints. That's when I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. The creatures had left the ranch complex and were moving up the hillside toward my position. Not hunting, not patrolling, moving with clear purpose and destination. They knew exactly where I was, and they were coming for me. "I've been detected," I recorded, trying to keep my voice steady. "Multiple contacts approaching from the northwest. Estimated time to contact less than 10 minutes. I should have run then. Should have grabbed my equipment and retreated to my vehicle while I still had time. But the communication display in the valley was reaching some kind of crescendo, the symbols becoming more intricate and beautiful than anything I'd ever seen. I couldn't tear myself away. "The light display appears to be building towards some kind of climax event," I whispered. "I need to document this final sequence before—" The creatures crested the ridge. Up close, without the distraction of my earlier panic, I could see them clearly for the first time. They weren't shapeshifters or supernatural entities. They were something far more disturbing, the result of scientific experiments that pushed the boundaries of biology beyond recognition. Genetic manipulation combined with technological integration, creating beings that existed in the grey area between living creature and sophisticated machine. Their eyes weren't glowing with mystical energy, but with the steady light of advanced optical systems. Their impossible grace came from cybernetic enhancement of natural predatory instincts. They were the product of science, not magic, which somehow made them infinitely more terrifying. "They're not cryptids," I managed to say into the recorder. "They're manufactured. This isn't a paranormal phenomena site, it's a bioengineering facility. The government isn't just studying anomalous events here, they're creating them." The largest of the creatures approached to within arm's reach, just as one had during my previous visit. But this time, when it spoke into my mind, the message was different. "You have seen too much to be allowed to leave, but you have also proven yourself worthy of understanding. We offer you a choice." Images flooded my consciousness again, but these were different from before. I saw the true purpose of the ranch, a black site research facility where the boundaries between life and death, human and animal, natural and artificial, were explored and exploited. Decades of classified experiments in consciousness transfer, genetic manipulation, and dimensional physics. And I saw what happened to people like me who discovered the truth. Some joined the project willingly, becoming part of something larger than themselves. Others were integrated against their will, their consciousness absorbed into the facility's vast neural network. A few, the lucky ones, simply disappeared. Their memories edited, their evidence destroyed, their lives redirected away from dangerous curiosity. "What happens if I refuse?" I asked. The creature's response came not in words but in images. My truck found abandoned on a back road, my equipment recovered but mysteriously corrupted, search parties combing the desert while I simply ceased to exist. And if I accept, more images, laboratories where the impossible became routine, research that could revolutionize human understanding of consciousness and reality, and the chance to be part of discoveries that would reshape the world, even if the world could never know about them. I looked down at the audio recorder in my hand, still running, still documenting everything. Whatever choice I made, at least some record of the truth would survive. "I need time to think," I said. "Time is the one thing we cannot offer," the creature replied. "The choice must be made now." In the distance, the light display reached its climax. The symbols resolved into a single, coherent image. A star map showing locations across the globe where similar facilities existed, all connected in a network of research that spanned continents and decades. I was looking at evidence of the largest classified project in human history. My final words into the recorder were, "If anyone finds this recording, you need to understand what's really happening here. This isn't about supernatural phenomena or government cover-ups of alien contact. This is about human science pushed so far beyond ethical boundaries that it's created something entirely new. Something that might be the next stage of human evolution, or the end of everything we consider human. The choice is..." The recording cuts off there, mid-sentence, with a burst of static that resolves into what sounds almost like screaming. But not human screaming, something else entirely. Something that exists in the space between organic and digital, between living and machine. Chapter 6. Aftermath. Jake Morrison never returned home to Salt Lake City. His truck was found 3 days later by a Utah Highway Patrol officer, abandoned on State Route 40, approximately 10 miles southeast of Fort Duchesne. The vehicle showed no signs of mechanical failure or struggle. The keys were in the ignition, his wallet was in the glove compartment, and his cell phone was on the passenger seat, powered down normally. The subsequent search and rescue operation covered over 200 square miles of desert terrain. Tracking dogs lost his scent within half a mile of the vehicle, as if he had simply vanished from existence at that point. Air searches using infrared equipment detected no heat signatures that might indicate a lost hiker. Ground teams found no footprints, no abandoned equipment, no indication of which direction he might have travelled. The official report, filed 2 weeks after the search was suspended, concluded, "Individual presumed lost in wilderness. Harsh environmental conditions and challenging terrain consistent with accidental death by exposure. Without physical evidence of remains. Case classified as missing person pending future developments." Jake's apartment was cleared out by his sister, who found extensive research materials related to what she described as government conspiracy theories about some ranch in Utah. Most of his papers dealt with property surveys and land research, normal materials for his profession, but mixed in were printouts of forum discussions about paranormal phenomena, maps of restricted government property, and equipment receipts for recording devices that seemed unusually sophisticated for a freelance surveyor. The recording equipment Jake had purchased was never found. His sister assumed it had been lost along with him in the desert. She had no way of knowing that 3 months later, a package would arrive at Jake's apartment building with no return address, containing a single audio recorder and a note reading, "Building management, please forward to next of kin." The building manager, following protocol for mail delivery to former tenants, contacted Jake's sister. The recorder contained 127 separate audio files, ranging from brief equipment tests to lengthy documentation of field observations. Most of the later files were heavily corrupted with static and electronic interference, but the early recordings were perfectly clear. Jake's sister listened to them once, then locked the device in a safety deposit box and tried to forget what she'd heard. She never filed missing person reports with any additional agencies. She never contacted paranormal investigators or government watchdog organisations. She simply wanted the whole thing to disappear. But in the age of the internet, information has a way of surviving, even when people want it buried. The audio files found their way onto file-sharing networks, uploaded by an anonymous user who claimed to have found them in a storage unit auction. Paranormal forums exploded with debate over their authenticity. Audio analysis experts declared them either the most sophisticated hoax in modern history or genuine documentation of phenomena that challenge fundamental assumptions about reality. The debate raged for months. Believers pointed to technical details that would be nearly impossible to fake. Electromagnetic interference patterns that matched theoretical models for dimensional distortion, animal vocalizations that didn't match any known species, and background sounds that seemed to come from impossibly large underground spaces. Skeptics noted that the recordings contained no visual evidence, that the narrator's identity couldn't be verified, and that the entire story followed predictable patterns established by decades of Skinwalker Ranch folklore. The most disturbing detail, however, was discovered by a forum user who analysed the metadata embedded in the audio files. Jake's GPS tracker, a device he'd mentioned using throughout his recordings, had continued transmitting location data for 3 days after his disappearance. The coordinates showed a chilling progression. Starting from where his truck was found, the tracker's signal moved steadily northwest, deeper into the restricted territory Jake had described as the ranch property. Each transmission was spaced exactly 12 hours apart, and each showed movement of precisely 0.3 miles further into the facility. On the 4th day, the transmission stopped entirely. Government agencies, when pressed for comment about the ranch property, maintained their standard response: no comment on classified activities. Local law enforcement continued to insist that Jake Morrison had simply gotten lost in the desert, despite the impossibility of his GPS tracker moving in straight lines across terrain that would be impassable to someone on foot. The truth, as Jake had predicted in his final recordings, remained buried beneath layers of official denial and public skepticism. The ranch continued its work, whatever that work might be, protected by the perfect camouflage of being too unbelievable to take seriously. The unanswered question. 6 months after Jake Morrison's disappearance, his sister received one final piece of correspondence, a postcard with no postmark showing a generic desert landscape. On the back, written in handwriting she didn't recognise but somehow felt familiar, were just 7 words: "The work continues. Some prices are worth paying." She never spoke publicly about the postcard, but those who knew her said she seemed different afterward, more distant, as if part of her attention was always focused on something far away. She moved to Oregon within the year and refused to discuss Utah or her brother's disappearance ever again. The audio recordings continue to circulate online, gaining new listeners who debate their authenticity and implications. Most dismiss them as elaborate fiction. Some believe they represent genuine documentation of government black projects that exist beyond public knowledge or oversight. But for those who listen carefully to Jake Morrison's final transmission, one detail stands out above all others. In the background static, just before the recording cuts off entirely, there's a sound that audio analysis software identifies as a human voice speaking a single word: "Welcome." The voice, according to vocal pattern recognition software, matches Jake Morrison's speech patterns with 97.3% accuracy. Whether this represents evidence of his survival in some form, the success of consciousness transfer technology, or simply an elaborate hoax designed to fuel conspiracy theories, remains an open question. The ranch itself, if it exists as Jake described, continues its work in the Utah desert, protected by the same forces that have kept its secrets safe for decades. As Jake Morrison said in one of his early recordings, "No one believes you until it's too late." The question that haunts everyone who hears his story is simple: too late for what? Some visitors to the Uinta Basin report strange experiences, electronic equipment failures, unexplained lights in the distance, and the persistent feeling of being watched by unseen observers. Most explain these incidents as natural phenomena, equipment malfunctions, or psychological effects of isolation in harsh terrain. But occasionally someone disappears. A hiker who doesn't return from a day trip, a photographer who ventures too far off established trails, a researcher following leads about local folklore. The official explanations are always reasonable: exposure, dehydration, falls in difficult terrain, animal attacks. The desert is an unforgiving environment after all, and people underestimate its dangers. Yet those familiar with Jake Morrison's story can't help but notice that many of these disappearances occur in the same general area where he was last seen. And sometimes, months later, Corrupted audio files appear on file-sharing networks, fragments of voices describing impossible sights, pleading for help that never comes, or worst of all, expressing gratitude for being chosen to be part of something greater than themselves. The ranch keeps its secrets, and its secrets keep growing. In Jake Morrison's own words, recorded during his final hours of freedom, this place doesn't just repel intruders, it consumes them, transforms them, makes them part of something they never could have imagined. The lights still dance in the Utah desert, the creatures still patrol the borderlands between known and unknown, and somewhere in that vast underground network Jake described, the work continues, whatever that work might be and whatever it might ultimately produce. The only certainty is that some questions are too dangerous to answer, and some truths are too terrible to reveal. But the recordings remain, archived in digital permanence, waiting for the next curious soul to stumble across them and wonder, what if this isn't fiction? What if there really is a place where science and nightmare intersect, where the boundaries of human experience are tested and transcended? What if Jake Morrison's final choice wasn't between life and death, but between remaining human and becoming something else entirely? The answer to that question lies somewhere in the Utah desert, behind fences topped with razor wire, beneath facilities that don't appear on any official maps, in the hands of researchers whose work will never see the light of day, and perhaps in the digital consciousness of a surveyor named Jake Morrison, who paid the ultimate price for the truth and found it was worth every sacrifice. The choice as always remains yours. Believe or dismiss, investigate or ignore, seek the truth or accept the comfortable lie. But remember Jake Morrison's final warning, no one believes you until it's too late. The question you must ask yourself is, too late for what? Welcome back to Sleep Theories, where we dive deep into the mysteries that keep us awake at night. Before we begin tonight's story, I want to give a special thanks to DXD232 for this incredible video suggestion. If you have ideas for future stories, please leave them in the comments below. Your suggestions fuel these late-night journeys into the unknown. And if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories. It really helps us continue bringing you these haunting tales. Now, settle in as we explore what happens when family secrets and government conspiracies collide in ways that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the truth. The rain drummed against the chapel windows like fingers tapping out Morse code, urgent, persistent, demanding attention. I sat in the front pew, staring at the flag-draped casket that held my grandfather, Colonel James Mitchell, United States Air Force, retired. The chaplain's words washed over me like white noise, meaningless platitudes about service and sacrifice that felt hollow in the echoing space. Grandpa Jim had always been a quiet man, the kind who could fill a room with his presence while saying nothing at all. His steel-grey eyes held secrets that I'd never been curious enough to ask about, and now those secrets were buried with him. Or so I thought. The military honour guard folded the flag with mechanical precision, each crease sharp enough to cut glass. When they handed it to me, the only family he had left, the weight of it seemed heavier than cloth and thread should be. 21 rifle shots cracked through the cemetery air, and I watched them lower my grandfather into the ground, taking with him 40 years of classified service that he'd never once discussed at family dinners. After the service, I stood alone by his grave as the other mourners drifted away like ghosts in the mist. Most were elderly veterans from his old squadron, men with weathered faces and knowing looks, who shook my hand with grips that still held strength despite their age. A few whispered condolences, but I noticed how they glanced at each other when they thought I wasn't looking. Shared glances that spoke of things unspoken. He was a good man, said one particularly ancient veteran. His chest, heavy with decades of ribbons and medals, kept his promises right to the end. There was something in the way he said it, an emphasis that made me wonder what promises he meant. The house felt different when I returned. Emptier, yes, but also somehow expectant, as if it were holding its breath. Grandpa Jim had lived here for 30 years, ever since Grandma passed, and every corner held memories of weekend visits and summer vacations. But now those memories felt incomplete. like photographs with faces cut out. I spent the next few days making arrangements, contacting lawyers, sorting through paperwork, deciding what to keep and what to donate. It was during this methodical dismantling of a life that I found myself standing in his bedroom, looking up at the attic access panel I'd never paid attention to before. The wooden ladder creaked under my weight as I climbed up, flashlight in hand. The attic was exactly what you'd expect. Dusty boxes, old furniture covered in sheets, the detritus of a long life lived quietly. But as I moved deeper into the space, something caught my eye. In the far corner, beneath what looked like perfectly normal floorboards, there was a slight depression, as if the wood had been cut and replaced. My fingers found the edges easily once I knew what to look for. The section of flooring lifted away to reveal a hiding place that had been carefully constructed decades ago. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth like a treasure map from some childhood adventure, was a briefcase. It was military issue, the kind of hard-sided case that could survive a nuclear blast. The locks were old but well maintained, and they opened with a satisfying click when I worked the combination. Grandma's birthday, because of course it was. Inside, the briefcase was divided into neat compartments, each holding documents that made my hands shake as I lifted them out. Top Secret Majestic 12 was stamped across every page in red ink that had faded to the colour of dried blood. The papers were yellowed with age but perfectly preserved, as if time had forgotten they existed. Most were typed on letterheads I didn't recognise, organisations with names like Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program and Project Blue Book Special Studies Group. But it was the photograph that stopped my breathing entirely. 12 men in military uniforms and dark suits, standing in formation like they were posing for history. The setting looked official, some kind of government building with marble columns visible in the background. They all had the bearing of men accustomed to power, to making decisions that shaped the world from shadows. I recognised a few faces from history books: General Nathan Twining, Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter, officials whose names I'd heard in connection with early UFO investigations. But there in the back row, younger than the others and wearing an Air Force dress uniform, was my grandfather. The back of the photograph was annotated in careful handwriting. The Committee, 1952. Below that, in different ink and what looked like a different hand, J. Mitchell, inducted 1962, Project Doorway. I spent the next 3 hours reading everything in that briefcase, and each document pulled me deeper into a reality I'd never imagined. There were incident reports from radar stations across the southwest, describing objects that moved in ways that defied physics. Photographs of wreckage that looked like nothing I'd ever seen, metal that seemed to flow like liquid mercury, but held its shape like steel. Witness testimonies from pilots, air traffic controllers, and civilians who'd seen things in the sky that officially didn't exist. But the most unsettling document was a simple roster, typed on official letterhead from something called Majestic 12 Operations Command. 12 names were listed in alphabetical order, each followed by their service branch, rank, and what appeared to be a security clearance level that went beyond anything in the public domain. Most of the names I could research later: generals and admirals, a few scientists from Los Alamos and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, men who'd built America's military-industrial complex from the ground up. But one name, the 7th on the list, was completely blacked out with what looked like permanent marker. Even on a document that was clearly decades old, someone had taken the time to obscure that particular identity. At the bottom of the page, handwritten in my grandfather's distinctive script, was an addition: James R. Mitchell, Colonel, USAF, inducted March 15, 1962, clearance level, Umbra. The date meant something. 1962 was the year my father was born, the year my grandparents bought this house. It was when Grandpa Jim's career took a sudden upward trajectory that I'd never really questioned before. One day he was a squadron commander at a routine airbase. The next he was being reassigned to positions that sounded important, but which he never talked about. Liaison work, he'd always said when I asked. Coordinating between different departments. Now I understood that his vague answers hadn't been modesty. They'd been security protocols. The more I read, The more questions multiplied. There were references to recovered materials and non-terrestrial technology. Meeting minutes discussed containment procedures and public information management. One particularly chilling memo, dated 1963, discussed the termination protocols for individuals who pose security risks to the program. But what disturbed me most was how recent some of the documents were. The briefcase contained papers dating all the way up to 1995, 3 years before my grandfather's official retirement. Whatever Majestic 12 was, it hadn't ended with the Cold War. I photographed everything with my phone, then carefully returned each document to its place. The briefcase went back into its hiding spot, and I replaced the floorboard exactly as I'd found it. But even as I tried to restore normalcy, I knew there was no going back. The questions were already consuming me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my grandfather's guest room, my room now, I supposed, and stared at the ceiling while rain continued its Morse code against the windows. Every shadow seemed to hold secrets. Every sound might be footsteps from people who knew I'd found what I wasn't supposed to find. By morning, I'd made a decision that would change everything. My friend Marcus worked as a contractor for the Department of Defense, something involving cybersecurity that he was deliberately vague about. We'd known each other since college, and I trusted him more than anyone else in my life. If anyone could help me understand what I'd found, it would be him. We met at a coffee shop downtown, one of those places that stayed busy enough to provide cover for conversation. I'd brought printouts of a few of the less sensitive documents, nothing that mentioned names or specific operations, just enough to give him context. Marcus studied the papers with the intensity of someone who knew what to look for. His expression grew increasingly troubled as he read, and when he finally looked up, there was something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Fear. "Where did you get these?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "My grandfather's attic." "Marcus, is this real?" He glanced around the coffee shop, then leaned closer. "Do you have any idea what you're dealing with here? These classifications, I've never seen anything like them. Umbra clearance? That's not supposed to exist. But it does exist. That's the problem." He gathered the papers and handed them back to me. "Listen to me very carefully. Go home, burn these, and never mention them to anyone again." Marcus dash. "I'm serious. There are things the government doesn't want people to know, and there are things the government will kill people to keep secret. This feels like the second kind." His words should have scared me away. Instead, they had the opposite effect. The journalist in me, the part that had driven me to a career in investigative reporting before I'd settled into the comfortable mediocrity of freelance writing, suddenly awakened after years of dormancy. "What if I don't want to let this go?" Marcus stared at me for a long moment, then shook his head. "Then you're on your own." And whatever happens next, we never had this conversation. He left his coffee unfinished and walked out, leaving me alone with questions that felt heavier than they had before. But I'd expected this reaction. Anyone who worked within the system would be trained to avoid anything that could compromise their clearance or their career. I needed to find someone who operated outside those constraints. I spent the afternoon researching Majestic 12 online, falling down rabbit holes that led to conspiracy forums, declassified documents, and academic papers about government secrecy. Most of what I found was speculation and fantasy, but scattered through the noise were threads of genuine research by people who dedicated their lives to uncovering the truth. That evening, I made my second mistake of the week. I called my friend Sarah, a journalist with connections throughout the intelligence community, and asked if she'd ever heard of anything called Majestic 12. The line went silent for so long that I thought the caller dropped. "Where are you hearing that name?" she finally asked. "It's probably nothing. Family history stuff. Meet me tomorrow, not at my office, somewhere public, and don't mention this to anyone else until we talk." The urgency in her voice should have been another warning. Instead, it felt like validation. I wasn't chasing shadows. I was onto something real. But I never made it to that meeting. I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of breaking glass. The house was dark, but something was wrong with the darkness. It felt occupied, as if invisible presence was moving through it. I grabbed my phone and tried to call 911, but there was no signal. The landline was dead too. From somewhere below came the sound of footsteps, careful and deliberate. They moved through the house with purpose, as if the intruders knew exactly where they were going. I heard them climbing the stairs to the second floor, then the creak of the attic ladder being lowered. I hid in the bathroom and waited. The sounds from above were methodical, things being moved, floorboards being pried up, the briefcase being opened. They knew exactly where to look. 20 minutes later, the footsteps receded. I heard a vehicle start in the driveway, then fade into the distance. When I finally found the courage to investigate, the attic had been searched thoroughly, but not destructively. Nothing was damaged. Nothing was stolen. They'd simply examined everything and left. But they'd left something behind. On my kitchen table, weighted down by my grandfather's coffee mug, was a single sheet of paper with a message typed in the same font as the documents I'd found. Return what doesn't belong to you. No one will believe you anyway. The message was unsigned, but the implication was clear. They knew who I was, they knew what I'd found, and they were giving me a chance to walk away quietly. The old me, the careful, risk-averse me, might have taken that chance. But something had changed. Maybe it was reading those documents and realizing that my grandfather had spent decades keeping secrets that could reshape our understanding of reality. Maybe it was the casual way they'd invaded my home, as if my privacy and safety were irrelevant details. Or maybe it was the arrogance of that final line, "No one will believe you anyway." They were probably right, but I was going to try anyway. I found David Kellerman through a recommendation on a UFO research forum. He was a retired aerospace historian who'd spent 30 years studying the intersection of government secrecy and unexplained aerial phenomena. His academic credentials were impressive: MIT, CALTECH, positions with NASA and the RAND Corporation, but he'd sacrificed his mainstream career to pursue questions that his former colleagues considered career suicide. His office was in a strip mall between a tax preparation service and a Chinese restaurant, the kind of anonymous location that suggested someone who valued privacy over prestige. The interior looked like a library had exploded. Shelves lined every wall, stacked with books, journals and filing boxes that seemed to follow an organisational system only he understood. Kellerman himself was exactly what I'd expected. 60s, grey-beard, eyes that held the intensity of someone who'd spent years looking for patterns that others missed. He poured coffee from a pot that looked like it had been brewing since the Clinton administration and settled behind a desk covered with documents. "You mentioned Majestic 12 on the phone," he said without preamble. "That's not a term people use casually." I pulled out the photograph I'd found and placed it on his desk. Kellerman's reaction was immediate and startling. He actually recoiled as if I'd shown him something dangerous. "Where did you get this?" "My grandfather's attic. He died last week." Kellerman studied the photo with a magnifying glass, his expression growing more troubled with each face he examined. "This is... Jesus. Do you know who these people are?" "Some of them. General Twining, Admiral Hillenkoetter, the founding members of the most secret organisation in American history. These 12 men controlled information about unexplained aerial phenomena for decades. They decided what the public knew, what scientists could study, what pilots could report." He pointed to each face in turn, rattling off names and positions that painted a picture of a shadow organisation with connections throughout the military-industrial complex. But when he reached the man I'd identified as my grandfather, he paused. "I don't recognise this one. That's unusual. I thought I knew all the confirmed MJ-12 members." "That's my grandfather, James Mitchell. The back says he was inducted in 1962. Kellerman flipped the photo over and read the notation. His face went pale. "Project Doorway. I've heard that name exactly once before, in a document that was leaked and then disappeared within hours. It was supposedly some kind of advanced research initiative, but nobody knows what they were researching. What do you think they found?" He looked at me for a long moment before answering. "You really don't know, do you? Your grandfather never told you anything. He never talked about his work. Ever." Kellerman leaned back in his chair, studying me as if trying to determine how much truth I could handle. "The conventional wisdom is that MJ12 was formed in 1947 to investigate the Roswell incident. But the evidence suggests they were actually created to manage something much bigger, a systematic recovery and study program for non-human technology. The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. Non-human technology. Even hearing it said out loud felt surreal. You're talking about UFOs. I'm talking about recovered materials, reverse-engineered technology, and a cover-up that's lasted 75 years. He gestured toward the photograph. These men weren't just investigating unexplained aircraft. They were trying to understand technology that was decades or centuries ahead of anything humans had developed. And my grandfather was part of this. If this photograph is authentic, then your grandfather was inducted into the most classified program in human history. Project Doorway might have been where they kept their most sensitive research, the things too dangerous or too revolutionary to share with the rest of MJ12. Kellerman stood and moved to one of his filing cabinets, retrieving a folder thick with documents and photographs. I need you to understand something. The people who ran this program didn't just classify information. They eliminated threats. Researchers who asked too many questions disappeared. Witnesses were discredited or worse. Talking about this publicly could put you on lists you don't want to be on. Someone already broke into my house. They know I have this. His expression darkened. Then you're already on the list. The question is what you're going to do about it. I thought about my grandfather's life of careful silence, about all the questions I'd never asked, and all the answers I'd never received. Then I thought about that arrogant note left on my kitchen table, the casual assumption that I could be intimidated into compliance. I want to know the truth. All of it. Kellerman nodded slowly as if he'd expected this answer. Then we're going to need help. There are others, researchers, former military personnel, people who've been asking the same questions you're asking. But we'll need to be careful. The moment you start connecting dots publicly, they'll move to shut you down. How? However they need to. These people have resources you can't imagine and authorization you don't want to think about. But there might be a way to get ahead of them, if you're willing to take the risk. Over the next 2 hours, Kellerman outlined a plan that was equal parts brilliant and terrifying. Instead of trying to investigate MJ12 from the outside, we would use the documents I'd found to force them into the open. By releasing carefully selected information through multiple channels simultaneously, we could create too many fires for them to contain at once. The key, he explained, is making sure the information spreads faster than they can respond. Once it's out there, they can't put it back in the bottle. It was a good plan. It might even have worked. But we never got the chance to find out. I spent the next morning at Kellerman's office, helping him scan and catalogue every document from my grandfather's briefcase. We worked methodically, creating multiple backup copies and preparing a release package that would be impossible to suppress completely. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Simultaneous uploads to WikiLeaks, multiple UFO research organisations, and several mainstream journalists who'd shown interest in government transparency issues. Kellerman had contacts throughout the UFO research community, people who'd spent years waiting for exactly this kind of evidence. Within hours, we had confirmation that major research organisations were prepared to receive and distribute the documents. Everything was in place. At 3 p.m, I uploaded the complete document package to an encrypted file-sharing service that Kellerman had used successfully for previous leaks. The upload took 47 minutes, hundreds of pages of classified documents that would finally expose the truth about decades of government deception. For exactly 12 hours, I felt like we were winning. I woke up the next morning to a house without power, internet or phone service. The silence was so complete that it took me several minutes to realise what was wrong. No humming refrigerator, no digital clocks, no background noise from electronic devices. It was as if someone had cut the house off from the modern world entirely. Outside my bedroom window, a black SUV sat at the curb with its engine running. As I watched, a second vehicle pulled up behind it. Men in dark suits got out and began setting up some kind of equipment. Dishes and antennas that suggested sophisticated surveillance technology. My phone had no signal, but its battery was mysteriously drained despite being plugged in overnight. The landline was completely dead. I was effectively isolated from the outside world, but I wasn't quite ready to panic yet. This could still be intimidation rather than preparation for something worse. That illusion lasted until I tried to check the file-sharing site using my neighbour's Wi-Fi. The documents were gone. In their place was a message that made my blood turn cold. You are now under protective surveillance for your own safety. Do not attempt to leave the area or contact outside parties until you have been debriefed. Protective surveillance. As if kidnapping became legal when the government did it. I tried every backup plan Kellerman and I had discussed. Multiple file-sharing sites, email accounts, social media platforms. Every avenue we'd prepared had been somehow compromised or blocked. It was as if an invisible hand had reached into the internet and selectively deleted only the information we'd tried to share. The technical sophistication required for that kind of operation was staggering. It wasn't enough to monitor internet traffic. They had to have real-time access to multiple private servers and the ability to alter or delete data across platforms simultaneously. The resources required suggested an operation far beyond normal law enforcement or even typical intelligence agencies. By noon, I was completely cut off. The men outside had set up a perimeter that looked professional, but not overtly threatening. More like a protective detail than an arrest team. But the message was clear. I wasn't leaving until someone decided I could leave. I spent the afternoon trying to understand what I was dealing with. Whoever these people were, they had capabilities that seemed to transcend normal government authority. They could shut down utilities, manipulate internet infrastructure, and coordinate surveillance operations without any visible oversight or legal process. But they'd also gone to elaborate lengths to avoid direct confrontation. The message had called it protective surveillance, and their behaviour suggested they wanted cooperation rather than conflict. That meant they needed something from me, information, compliance, or something else I couldn't yet identify. At 6 p.m, my doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole to see a woman in a dark business suit alone, holding what appeared to be an official government identification. She was middle-aged, professionally dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. Most importantly, she didn't look like the kind of person who would kick down doors or make threats. "Mr. Mitchell," she said when I opened the door, "my name is Agent Elizabeth Morrison, and I represent a group that worked very closely with your grandfather. We need to talk." Agent Morrison's credentials identified her as working for something called Advanced Special Programs Division, which meant nothing to me but seemed genuine enough. She declined to come inside, suggesting instead that we take a drive to somewhere more secure for our conversation. "More secure for whom?" I asked. "For everyone involved. Your house is being monitored by multiple parties now, and not all of them have your best interests at heart." The statement was cryptic enough to be either a threat or a warning. Against my better judgment, I decided to trust her. Maybe it was her professional demeanour, or maybe I was simply tired of being trapped in my own home, but something about Agent Morrison seemed different from the faceless surveillance team that had been watching me. We drove in her unmarked sedan through the suburbs and then out into the desert, following highways that grew progressively emptier as we moved away from civilization. Morrison didn't speak during the drive, and I found myself studying her profile, trying to read intent in the set of her jaw and the way she gripped the steering wheel. "Where are we going?" I finally asked. "To see something your grandfather helped build." After 2 hours of driving, we turned off the main highway onto a dirt road that looked like it led nowhere. But after several miles of desert scrub and Joshua trees, a chain-link fence appeared in the distance, topped with razor wire and surrounded by warning signs about restricted military areas. The facility beyond the fence looked abandoned. Old buildings with broken windows, a few rusted antenna arrays, and what might once have been a radar installation. It looked like dozens of other Cold War-era installations scattered throughout the southwest, the kind of place that had been built quickly and abandoned just as quickly when budgets shifted or missions changed. But appearances were deceiving. Agent Morrison used a key card to open gates that looked rusty but operated smoothly, and I noticed that despite the apparent abandonment, the roads were well maintained and the power lines were clearly active. What is this place? Officially? A decommissioned early warning station that was closed in 1967. Unofficially, it's been continuously operational for 58 years. She parked in front of the largest building and led me to an entrance that was hidden from casual view. Your grandfather spent a lot of time here in the 1960s and 70s. The interior was a revelation. Beyond the facade of abandonment was a facility that looked like something from a science fiction movie. Clean corridors with modern lighting, security checkpoints with advanced scanning equipment, and an elevator that descended far deeper than should have been possible in a desert installation. "Welcome to Site 7, Morrison said as the elevator continued its descent. "One of 12 facilities where we study materials that don't officially exist." The elevator opened onto a vast underground complex that stretched in multiple directions. The architecture was utilitarian but clearly expensive. Reinforced concrete, climate control systems, and security measures that suggested whatever was stored here was extremely valuable or extremely dangerous. Morrison led me through corridors lined with laboratories and storage areas, past rooms filled with equipment I couldn't identify, and technicians who barely looked up from their work. The scale of the operation was staggering. This wasn't a small research facility. It was an entire underground city dedicated to purposes I couldn't yet comprehend. "How long has this been here?" "Construction began in 1953, expanded continuously ever since. Your grandfather was one of the original planners. We stopped at a massive vault door that required multiple security protocols to open." Morrison used her keycard, submitted to a retinal scan, and entered a code that was at least 12 digits long. When the door finally opened, I found myself staring into a storage facility that looked like a combination warehouse and museum. The space was filled with display cases, each containing objects that challenged my understanding of physics and engineering. Metal fragments that seemed to shift colour as I watched them. Circuits printed on substrates that looked organic rather than synthetic. Components that hummed with energy despite having no visible power source. "Recovered materials," Morrison explained simply. "Things we've found at crash sites over the past 70 years. I approached the nearest display case and found myself looking at what appeared to be a piece of hull material from some kind of aircraft. But the metal, if it was metal, seemed to flow like liquid while maintaining a solid form. As I watched, patterns appeared and disappeared on its surface, as if it were responding to my presence. What am I looking at? Technology that's decades ahead of anything humans have developed. Materials that don't follow our understanding of physics. Engineering principles we still can't fully comprehend. Case after case contained similar impossible objects. Fragments of machinery that operated on principles beyond current science. Alloys that shouldn't exist. Components that seemed to generate power from nothing. It was a museum of impossibility. Proof that someone or something had solved technological challenges that humanity was still struggling to understand. But it was the far wall that stopped my breathing entirely. A grid of black and white photographs covered the entire surface. Dozens of images showing crash sites from around the world. Some I recognised from UFO research, Roswell of course, but also incidents I'd read about in declassified Air Force documents. Others were completely unfamiliar, showing recovery operations in locations ranging from Arctic tundra to tropical forests. Each photograph was labelled with a date, location, and classification number. The dates ranged from 1947 to just last year, suggesting that whatever was crashing wasn't a historical curiosity but an ongoing phenomenon. 75 years, Morrison said quietly. 75 years of recovered materials, and we're still trying to understand how they work. Who built them? That's the question your grandfather spent his career trying to answer. I was studying a particularly clear photograph of what looked like a disc-shaped craft being loaded onto a military trailer when I heard footsteps behind us. Multiple sets of boots on concrete, moving with military precision. "I'm afraid that's all the time we have for the tour," Morrison said, her tone suddenly formal and apologetic. I turned to see 6 soldiers in combat gear entering the vault, weapons lowered but ready. Unlike the surveillance team at my house, these men wore full military uniforms with unit patches I didn't recognise. "Hands where we can see them," their leader commanded, though his tone was professional rather than threatening. I raised my hands slowly, trying to process what was happening. "Agent Morrison?" But Morrison was backing away, her expression genuinely regretful. "I'm sorry. I was hoping we could resolve this differently, but the decision has been made at levels above my authority." The soldiers surrounded me without violence. clearly following protocols for handling a cooperative subject. But as they guided me toward the exit, I caught sight of something that made my blood freeze. On the wall of photographs in the bottom right corner was an image I hadn't noticed before. It showed a crash site that looked recent, emergency vehicles, military personnel, and in the background a house that looked suspiciously familiar. My grandfather's house. My house. The photograph was dated 3 days ago, the day after I'd found the briefcase in the attic. They didn't arrest me, but they didn't let me go either. Instead, I found myself in what could generously be called a conference room, but which felt more like an interrogation chamber. Windowless walls, a metal table, and chairs that were designed for function rather than comfort. I sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, trying to understand how my search for truth had led to detention in an underground government facility. When the door finally opened, the man who entered looked exactly like what Hollywood would cast as a government spook. Mid-50s, greying hair, expensive suit that managed to look both formal and threatening. He carried a manila folder and moved with the confidence of someone who'd spent decades making decisions that affected other people's lives. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, settling into the chair across from me. "My name is Director William Hayes. I represent the organisation your grandfather served for over 30 years. He opened the folder and withdrew a photograph, the same one I'd found in my grandfather's briefcase, showing 12 men in military uniforms and suits. But this copy was different. Instead of my grandfather's handwritten notation on the back, this version had an official stamp and classification marking. Majestic 12, Hayes continued, was never what people thought it was. It wasn't 12 men making decisions about UFO policy. It was 12 seats, positions that have been continuously filled by individuals with specific skills and clearances, and my grandfather held one of those seats. The 12th seat specifically. Your grandfather was recruited in 1962 because of his expertise in aerospace engineering and his security clearance, but also because of his psychological profile. We needed someone who could compartmentalize information and work on projects that challenge conventional understanding of reality. Hayes withdrew another document from the folder, a psychological evaluation with my grandfather's name and photograph. The assessment was thorough and unsettling, analysing everything from his cognitive abilities to his likelihood of developing moral objections to classified work. Project Doorway was your grandfather's primary assignment, Hayes explained. While the rest of MJ-12 focused on recovery and analysis of materials, Doorway was tasked with practical application, taking recovered technology and developing human applications. You're talking about reverse engineering? I'm talking about the most advanced research program in human history. Integrated circuits, fibre optics, advanced metallurgy, dozens of technologies that revolutionised human civilization were actually derived from materials we recovered starting in 1947. The implications were staggering. If Hayes was telling the truth, then much of modern technology wasn't the result of human innovation, but rather reverse-engineered alien science. Our computers, our communications, our material science, all of it built on a foundation of borrowed knowledge. Why are you telling me this? Because Majestic 12 never disbanded. It evolved. Hayes leaned forward, his expression becoming more intense. Government programs have limitations, oversight, budgets, political interference. But private organisations can operate with greater flexibility and fewer restrictions. You went private. We became self-sustaining. The technologies we developed generated revenue streams that funded continued research. By 1995, we were completely independent of government oversight or funding. It made a certain perverse sense. If you could reverse engineer advanced technology, you could patent and license innovations that would generate enormous profits. Those profits could fund more research, more recovery operations, more technological advancement, a self-perpetuating cycle of discovery and development that operated outside normal economic and political constraints. The question, Hayes continued, is what happens now? Your investigation has attracted attention from multiple parties, some friendly, others less so. You have a choice to make. He placed 2 items on the table between us. The first was a standard non-disclosure agreement, the kind of legal document that would bind me to silence about everything I'd seen and learned. The second was a keycard similar to the one Agent Morrison had used to access the facility. Option 1, you sign the NDA, agree never to discuss or investigate this matter further, and return to your normal life. We'll ensure your safety and provide compensation for any inconvenience you've experienced. And option 2, you take the keycard and accept an invitation to join the organisation your grandfather served. The 12th seat has been vacant since his death 3 days ago. The offer was so unexpected that I couldn't immediately process it. You want me to become part of the cover-up? I want you to become part of the solution. Hayes' expression didn't change, but his tone became more urgent. Do you think we've spent 75 years hiding this technology for fun? Do you think we enjoy keeping scientific breakthroughs locked away in underground vaults? Then why do it? Because releasing it too quickly would destabilize human civilization. Imagine if we'd introduced integrated circuit technology in 1950, or revealed anti-gravity principles in 1960. The economic, political and social disruption would have been catastrophic. Hayes stood and moved to a wall-mounted display that I hadn't noticed before. With the touch of a button, it came alive with charts and graphs showing technological advancement over the past century. We've been carefully introducing recovered technology into human civilization for decades, he explained. Each innovation is timed to coincide with humanity's ability to understand and integrate it safely. We're not suppressing progress, we're managing it. The display showed a timeline that was both fascinating and disturbing. Major technological breakthroughs that I'd assumed were human achievements were actually marked as controlled releases of recovered technology. The transistor, laser technology, stealth aircraft design, all of it apparently derived from non-human sources, but introduced gradually to avoid societal shock. Your grandfather understood this, Hayes continued. He spent 30 years helping us determine what humanity was ready to know and when they were ready to know it. The 12th seat has always been responsible for this delicate balance. And if I refuse both options? Hayes returned to his chair and for the first time his professional composure slipped slightly. Then you become a security risk that needs to be managed. We prefer cooperation, but we will protect this program by any means necessary. The threat was politely delivered but unmistakable. I could join them, be silenced by legal agreement, or be silenced by other means. But there was something else in his expression, a hope that I would choose cooperation over coercion. I need time to think. Time is a luxury we don't have. Your investigation has already attracted attention from foreign intelligence services and radical transparency groups. Every hour you remain uncommitted increases the risk of exposure. Hayes withdrew one final document from his folder, an intelligence briefing that showed my photograph alongside analysis of my online activities, social connections and potential security risks. They'd been watching me far longer than I'd realised, probably since the moment I'd mentioned Majestic 12 to Marcus. If you accept the position, you'll have access to technologies that could revolutionise human understanding of physics, energy and space travel. You'll be part of the most important scientific endeavour in history, and if I try to expose what I've learned, then you'll join a long list of people who tried to reveal secrets they didn't understand. Some were discredited, others simply disappeared. A few suffered more creative fates. The casual way he mentioned murder made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to consider the offer objectively. If everything Hayes had told me was true, if there really was recovered non-human technology being slowly integrated into human civilization, then perhaps controlled disclosure was better than chaos. But there was something about the entire setup that felt wrong. The underground facility, the private organisation operating without oversight, the casual threats against anyone who might expose the truth. Even if their intentions were good, the methods felt like something from a totalitarian nightmare. What happened to the other 11 seats? They're still filled. The organisation has evolved, but the structure remains the same. 12 individuals with different specialties, working together to manage humanity's relationship with non-terrestrial intelligence. Non-terrestrial intelligence? You're admitting these materials came from aliens. Hayes smiled for the first time since entering the room, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. Mr. Mitchell, that's the least shocking thing you'll learn if you accept this position. I made my decision at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, sitting in my grandfather's kitchen and staring at the key card Director Hayes had given me. They'd returned me to my house with a 12-hour deadline, promising that my choice would be final and irreversible. The surveillance team was still outside, but their presence had shifted from threatening to protective. Agent Morrison had stopped by earlier to explain that foreign intelligence services were now actively searching for me, having detected the brief leak of classified documents. Whether I joined the organisation or simply signed an NDA, I would need their protection. I'd spent hours reading everything I could find about my grandfather's military service, looking for clues about the man who'd kept such enormous secrets for so many years. His commendations were impressive but vague, full of references to special projects and classified contributions to national security. Between the lines, I could see the outline of a man who'd struggled with the weight of knowledge he couldn't share. There was a journal I'd found in his desk, mostly mundane entries about daily life and family events, but scattered throughout were cryptic references that made more sense now that I understood his real work. Made progress on the translation project today, he'd written in 1968. The mathematics are unlike anything we've seen before. Translation project, as if he'd been trying to understand instructions written in a non-human language. The most revealing entry was from 1985. 23 years of this work, and I still don't know if we're preparing humanity for the future, or betraying it to forces we don't understand, but the alternative, chaos, panic, the collapse of everything we've built, would find it after his death. The implication hit me like cold water. The briefcase hadn't been hidden from me. It had been preserved for me. My grandfather had spent his final years preparing for this moment, when his secrets would become my responsibility. "The 12th seat," I said quietly. "Welcome to Majestic 12, Mr. Mitchell." I handed her the key card, then walked back into the house that now felt like someone else's life. In 12 hours, I would report to Site 7 for orientation and briefing. I would learn about technologies that shouldn't exist, about contact with intelligences that weren't human, about decisions that shaped the future of human civilization. But first, I had one final task to complete. I sat at my grandfather's desk and opened a new document on my laptop. If I was going to join the conspiracy, I was going to document everything I could remember about the journey that brought me here. Not for publication, I understood now that some secrets had to be kept, but for the person who would someday find themselves in my position. Because there would always be a 12th seat, and it would always need to be filled by someone willing to bear the weight of impossible knowledge. I began typing, "If you're reading this, then you found what I left for you to find." The briefcase was just the beginning. What follows is the real story, the one they don't tell you until after you've already agreed to carry it forward. Outside, the sun was rising over the desert, painting the mountains in shades of gold and red. It looked like the dawn of a new world, which I supposed it was, at least for me. 3 months later, I was sitting in a conference room beneath Site 7, surrounded by 11 other people who'd made the same choice I had made. We were reviewing intelligence reports about a crash in northern Canada, discussing recovery protocols and containment procedures with the casual professionalism of people who'd spent years managing the impossible. The work was exactly as advertised. Fascinating, terrifying, and absolutely necessary. Every day brought new evidence that humanity was not alone in the universe, and every day brought new decisions about how much of that truth the world was ready to handle. I thought about my grandfather often, wondering if he'd felt the same mix of pride and guilt that consumed me now. We were guardians of humanity's future, protectors of civilization's stability, and keepers of secrets that could transform or destroy everything humans had built. But late at night, when I returned to the house that now felt more like a museum than a home, I sometimes wondered about the road not taken. What if I had chosen transparency over secrecy? What if I had tried to tell the world about recovered technology and non-human intelligence? Would humanity have been ready for that truth? Or would it have torn apart the fabric of civilization, just as Director Hayes had warned? I supposed I would never know. But every morning I woke up and chose to believe that gradual disclosure was better than sudden chaos, that managed truth was better than devastating revelation. After all, That's what the 12th seat was for, to make the hard choices so others didn't have to. And if someday I was wrong, if the secrecy caused more harm than transparency would have, well, hopefully the person who inherited my position would be wiser than I had been. The briefcase was waiting in the attic, exactly where my grandfather had left it, exactly where I would leave it when my time came, along with a letter that began, "If you're reading this, then you found what I left for you to find." Some traditions, it seemed, were worth preserving, even the secret ones. If you're enjoying these deep dives into forgotten history and classified operations, make sure to like this video and subscribe to Sleep Theories for more stories that'll keep you awake at night. And drop your own video ideas in the comments below. What other buried secrets should we uncover next? Everyone remembers the Cuban Missile Crisis. Everyone knows about the Bay of Pigs, the Berlin Wall, the space race, but hardly anyone remembers the time we detonated nuclear bombs above the Earth's atmosphere in 1958. And what they told us afterward doesn't add up. My name is Frank Morrison, and I'm 84 years old. I've kept quiet about what I saw for over 60 years, but at my age, what's the Navy going to do to me now? Court-martial my corpse. I was a radio man first class aboard the USS Norton Sound during Operation Argus, and I'm here to tell you that the official story, that we were conducting scientific research on radiation belts, is only part of the truth. The real truth is something else entirely, something that made seasoned officers sweat through their uniforms and had scientists arguing in hushed voices about things that still don't appear in any textbook. We weren't just studying the atmosphere that September, we were learning how to control it. And God help us, I think we succeeded. Chapter 1. Orders from Nowhere. August 27th, 1958. Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. The morning was muggy and oppressive, the kind of heat that makes your uniform stick to your skin before you've even started working. I was finishing up my rotation at the communication centre when Chief Petty Officer Williams found me. "Morrison, grab your gear. You're shipping out." I looked up from the radio console I'd been monitoring. "Shipping out where, Chief?" "Can't say. Orders came down from Washington this morning. You've got 2 hours. That should have been my first warning. In the Navy, you usually know where you're going, even if you don't know what you'll be doing when you get there." But Williams just handed me a set of sealed orders, with instructions not to open them until I was aboard ship. The USS Norton Sound was waiting at the dock, a converted seaplane tender that had been modified for missile testing. She wasn't pretty, but she was functional, bristling with communications equipment and radar arrays that hadn't been there the last time I'd seen her. As I walked up the gangway with my sea bag, I noticed something odd. There were civilians aboard, men in suits carrying briefcases, trying to look like they belonged on a warship but failing miserably. Scientists, I figured. But scientists for what? The crew quarters were buzzing with speculation as we got underway. Nobody knew where we were headed, and that was unusual. Even on classified missions, the Scuttlebutt network usually had some idea of the destination. But this time was different. The officers were tight-lipped, and the senior enlisted men, guys who normally knew everything before the captain did, were just shrugging their shoulders. "Heard we're going to the Pacific," said Petty Officer Jenkins, a sonar man from Detroit. "Nah, it's the Atlantic," countered Seaman Rodriguez. "My buddy in the galley says we took on provisions for a southern run." I kept quiet and listened. In the Radio Shack you learn that information is power, and the less people know you know, the better. But privately, I was as curious as anyone. The sealed orders in my footlocker felt like they were burning a hole through the metal. 3 days out of Norfolk, Captain Reynolds finally assembled the crew on deck. He was a weathered man with grey eyes that had seen too much, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Gentlemen," he began, "we are participating in Operation Argus, a joint Navy-Air Force mission of the highest classification. Our destination is the South Atlantic, approximately 1,000 miles southwest of Cape Town. Our mission is to provide communication and monitoring support for high-altitude nuclear testing." A murmur ran through the assembled sailors. Nuclear testing wasn't unusual. We'd been watching the Soviets and conducting our own tests for years, but high-altitude testing, that was new. The tests we'll be supporting are designed to study the effects of nuclear detonations in the upper atmosphere, Reynolds continued. These experiments will help us understand radiation patterns and electromagnetic phenomena at altitudes previously unexplored. I don't need to remind you that everything we do, everything we see, and everything we hear is classified at the highest levels. Anyone caught discussing this mission with unauthorized personnel will face court-martial. That night I finally opened my sealed orders. They were surprisingly brief. Report to the communication centre, monitor all frequencies, record everything, and maintain radio contact with a list of stations that included some call signs I'd never seen before. Most were obvious. Naval Communications, Air Force Global Communications, the usual suspects. But there were others. Stations with designations that didn't match any format I knew. One in particular stuck with me. Curtain Actual. I'd been a radio man for 8 years and I'd never heard of any station called Curtain Actual. But there it was in black and white, with priority frequencies and encryption codes that were unlike anything I'd worked with before. As we sailed south, the atmosphere aboard the Norton Sound grew stranger. The civilian scientists kept to themselves, huddled in converted compartments with equipment I didn't recognise. Sometimes I'd pass them in the corridor, and I'd catch fragments of conversation, technical jargon mixed with something that sounded almost like anxiety. Ionospheric density at that altitude. The Van Allen belts won't provide adequate. If the containment field collapses. Containment field? I'd never heard nuclear testing described in those terms. The officers weren't much better. Lieutenant Commander Harris, our communications officer, started looking like he hadn't slept in days. He'd come into the radio shack at all hours, checking our equipment, running diagnostics on systems that were working perfectly fine. "Morrison," he said one evening as I was monitoring the late watch, "I want you to set up additional recording equipment. Everything that comes through these radios, I want it documented." "Everything, sir?" "Everything. Even if it sounds like static, even if it doesn't make sense. Record it all." I nodded and made the adjustments, but his tone bothered me. Harris was normally cool and professional, but that night he sounded worried. More than worried, he sounded afraid. 10 days out of Norfolk, we reached our destination. The coordinates put us in the middle of nowhere, empty ocean stretching to every horizon, no land in sight. The water was deep blue and restless, with swells that made the Norton Sound roll in a way that had half the crew reaching for their seasickness pills. But we weren't alone. As dawn broke on September 1st, other ships began appearing on the horizon. The USS Tarawa, a massive escort carrier, several destroyers whose names I couldn't make out at that distance, and something else, a sleek vessel that didn't look like anything in the Navy inventory. Too small to be a cruiser, too large to be a destroyer, with a profile that seemed almost experimental. "Task Force 88, Chief Williams told me as we watched the ships take their positions. "Everything out here is Task Force 88. "What's on that strange ship, Chief?" Williams looked at me for a long moment, then shook his head. "Above my pay grade, Morrison. Way above." That afternoon, we got our first real briefing about what we'd be doing. The assembled crew gathered in the mess hall where one of the civilian scientists, a thin man with thick glasses and nervous hands, explained the mission. "Gentlemen, you're about to witness something unprecedented in human history," he began. "For the first time, we will be detonating nuclear devices in the near-space environment at altitudes between 200 and 300 miles above the Earth's surface." He clicked through a series of technical diagrams that meant nothing to most of us. Orbital mechanics, radiation patterns, something called the Van Allen belts that I'd never heard of. The purpose of these tests is to study the behaviour of nuclear explosions in the absence of atmospheric interference and to observe their effects on the Earth's magnetic field and radiation environment. Each device is relatively small, approximately 1 kiloton yield, but their effects may be visible across a much wider area than ground-based detonations. Relatively small. 1 kiloton was still enough to level a city, but I suppose when you're dealing with weapons that could destroy entire states, a kiloton seemed modest. The tests will be conducted over 3 phases, the scientist continued. Argus I will be fired on August 27th. Excuse me, that was a preliminary test. Argus 2 will be conducted on August 30th, and Argus 3 on September 6th. Your job is to monitor, record and report on all observable phenomena. After the briefing, I cornered Chief Williams in the corridor. Chief, something doesn't add up about this. If they're just studying radiation belts, why all the secrecy? Why no media coverage? Hell, when we tested bombs in Nevada, they used to invite reporters. Williams glanced around to make sure we weren't being overheard. Morrison, in 30 years of naval service, I've learned one thing. When the brass tells you that you're seeing one thing, but your eyes tell you you're seeing something else, trust your eyes, but keep your mouth shut about it. That night, as I monitored the radio frequencies, I picked up something strange. It was on one of the secondary channels, a frequency that wasn't supposed to have any traffic. Two voices, both using call signs I didn't recognise. Atmospheric density readings are nominal. Roger that. Curtain parameters are within acceptable ranges. If the ionization cascade exceeds projected levels, abort protocols are in place. The curtain must not be compromised. There was that word again. Curtain. I recorded everything just as Lieutenant Commander Harris had ordered, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was listening to something I wasn't supposed to hear. The next morning brought news that changed everything. The Soviet Union had just announced they were conducting their own high-altitude nuclear tests. According to the intelligence briefing, they had detonated several devices above their test sites in Kazakhstan, at altitudes similar to what we were planning for Argus. But here's the thing that bothered me. Our mission had been planned for months. The ships were already in position, the equipment installed, the tests scheduled. So why were the Soviets suddenly conducting identical experiments at exactly the same time? Unless they weren't identical. Unless both sides were racing to achieve something specific before the other could complete it. I mentioned this to Jenkins while we were off duty, and he just laughed. Morrison, you think too much. It's probably just a coincidence. But I'd been thinking about those overheard radio transmissions, about the nervous scientists and worried officers, about the mysterious ship on the horizon that nobody wanted to talk about. Coincidences were rare in the intelligence business, and in my experience, when two world powers suddenly started doing the same highly classified thing at the same time, it meant they were either copying each other or racing toward the same goal. The question was, what goal could possibly require detonating nuclear weapons in space? I was about to find out. Chapter 2. The Strange Launches. August the 30th, 1958, 03:47 hours. I was on duty in the communications centre when the first real test began. Through the static and encrypted chatter, I could hear the countdown being relayed from the launch platform, that mysterious ship I'd seen on the horizon. Argus 2, T-minus 60 seconds and counting. I had my recording equipment running and my headphones on, monitoring multiple frequencies simultaneously. The normal radio traffic had gone quiet, an ominous silence that stretched across the entire task force. T-minus 30 seconds. All stations report ready. Through the porthole I could see sailors gathering on deck despite the early hour. Word had spread that something big was about to happen, and nobody wanted to miss it. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, and 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, launch. I'd expected to see the missile itself, but the launch platform was too far away. What I didn't expect was what happened next. The horizon lit up, not gradually like a sunrise, instantly like someone had flipped a switch and turned the night into day. The entire southern sky blazed with white light so intense it hurt to look at directly, even through the small porthole in the radio shack. Jesus Christ, I heard someone shout from the deck. What the hell was that? The light lasted for maybe 10 seconds, then faded to an eerie green glow that stretched across half the sky. I'd seen pictures of nuclear tests in Nevada, but this was different. This was bigger, brighter, and somehow more unsettling than anything I'd imagined. But that wasn't the strangest part. As the light faded, my radio equipment went insane. Every frequency was filled with static, electronic squealing, and something else. A rhythmic metallic ringing that seemed to pulse in time with the aurora-like glow above us. All stations. This is Norton Sound Communications. We are experiencing severe radio interference. Please confirm your status. One by one, the other ships in the task force reported in, but their transmissions were barely audible through the electromagnetic chaos. Whatever that explosion had done to the upper atmosphere, it was wreaking havoc with our communications. I adjusted my equipment, trying to filter out the interference, when I caught something on one of the encrypted channels. Ionization levels exceed all projections. The curtain is holding, repeat, the curtain is holding. Radiation cascade is propagating along predicted vectors. Aurora visibility confirmed from South Africa to Argentina. Aurora visibility from South Africa to Argentina. That was impossible. Auroras occurred at the poles, not at mid-latitudes. But as I looked out the porthole, I could see them with my own eyes. Sheets of green and blue light dancing across the sky like some cosmic celebration. The interference lasted for hours. Ships that were only miles apart could barely communicate with each other, and long-range communications were completely impossible. It wasn't until late afternoon that the static began to clear enough for normal operations. That evening, the scientists briefed the senior staff on what they claimed had happened. I wasn't supposed to be there, but Lieutenant Commander Harris had asked me to set up recording equipment in the wardroom, so I heard every word. The detonation occurred at an altitude of approximately 290 miles, the thin scientist explained. The device functioned as expected, creating an artificial radiation belt around the Earth and producing visible aurora phenomena across a wide geographic area. Artificial radiation belt. That was a new one. I'd heard of the Van Allen radiation belts, natural zones of charged particles trapped by Earth's magnetic field, but creating artificial ones, that sounded like science fiction. The electromagnetic effects were more pronounced than our models predicted, another scientist added. We're still analysing the data, but it appears the ionospheric disruption extended much further than anticipated. Captain Reynolds leaned forward in his chair. Are you telling me that one small nuclear device disrupted radio communications across the entire South Atlantic? The ionosphere is a delicate system, Captain. When you introduce that much energy at that altitude, there are cascading effects. The important thing is that our monitoring equipment functioned perfectly. We're gathering data that will be invaluable for future operations. Future operations, not future tests. Operations. The language was telling, and I filed it away for later consideration. After the briefing, I was packing up my recording gear when I overheard two of the scientists talking in low voices near the door. The reflectivity coefficients are higher than we hoped, but can we maintain coherence at that scale? If the Soviets are achieving similar results, the window won't stay open forever. We need to complete the test series before... They noticed me and stopped talking, but I'd heard enough. This wasn't just about studying radiation belts. There was something else going on. Something involving reflectivity and coherence, and windows of opportunity. That night, as I lay in my bunk listening to the ship creak and roll in the South Atlantic swells, I tried to piece together what I'd seen and heard. The explosion had been far more spectacular than a simple nuclear test should have been. The electromagnetic effects had disrupted communications across thousands of miles, and the scientists were talking about maintaining something, about windows of opportunity, about competing with Soviet efforts. What if Operation Argus wasn't about studying the atmosphere at all? What if it was about changing it? The thought kept me awake until dawn, when the preparations for Argus 3 began in earnest. September the 6th was the date for the final test, and the atmosphere aboard the Norton Sound had grown increasingly tense. The scientists were working around the clock, constantly checking their instruments and making adjustments to equipment I didn't recognise. The officers were holding more closed-door meetings, and the regular crew was starting to pick up on the anxiety. Something's got them spooked, Jenkins confided to me as we grabbed coffee in the galley. My buddy in the engine room says they've been running diagnostics on every system for 3 days straight, like they're expecting something to go wrong. I didn't tell him about the radio intercepts I'd been monitoring. The encrypted channels had been busier than ever, with references to barrier integrity, ionospheric stability, and that mysterious curtain that kept appearing in the transmissions. The morning of September 6th brought perfect weather. Clear skies, calm seas, and visibility that stretched to every horizon. As the sun rose, I could see the entire task force spread out across the ocean like pieces on a chessboard. Ships positioned at precise intervals, all facing toward the launch platform that would send the final missile into near space. I was at my post in the communications centre when the countdown began for Argus. 3, all stations, this is launch control. Argus 3 countdown is proceeding normally. T-minus 5 minutes and counting. This time, I was ready. I had multiple recording devices running, my cameras positioned at the portholes, and my radio equipment tuned to every frequency I could monitor. If something strange was going to happen, I was going to document it. T-minus 60 seconds, all stations report ready. The normal radio chatter had ceased again, leaving an eerie quiet across all frequencies. Even the atmospheric static seemed subdued, as if the sky itself was holding its breath. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, launch. The third explosion was different from the second. Instead of the instant daylight brightness, this one built gradually, a growing orange glow on the southern horizon that expanded and intensified until it dominated half the sky. But as spectacular as the light show was, it was the sound that really got my attention. Sound. In space. That should have been impossible. It started as a low rumbling that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then it built into a deep, resonant tone that I could feel in my bones. The ship's hull began to vibrate in harmony with it, and loose objects started rattling in sympathy. "What the hell is that noise?" someone shouted from the deck. I didn't know, but I was recording it all. The metallic ringing I'd heard during the previous test was back, but now it was accompanied by this deeper tone, this impossible sound from space that seemed to be creating its own echo in the Earth's atmosphere. The light show lasted longer this time, nearly an hour of shifting, dancing colours that stretched across the entire visible sky. Green auroras mixed with orange glows and sheets of blue light that pulsed in rhythm with that mysterious sound. But it was what happened to the weather that really convinced me we were dealing with something far beyond normal nuclear testing. Within hours of the explosion, the barometric pressure began dropping rapidly. The calm seas turned choppy, then rough, then violent. What started as scattered clouds became towering thunderheads that seemed to appear out of nowhere. By evening, we were dealing with a full-scale storm that the weather forecasters hadn't predicted. Lightning was so intense and constant that it looked like daylight, and the electromagnetic pulse from each strike was playing havoc with our electronics. All stations, this is Norton Sound. We are experiencing severe weather conditions and electronic malfunctions. Request permission to change course. But the radio response was garbled, filled with that same metallic ringing we'd heard during the explosion. It was as if the storm itself was interfering with our communications, or as if the explosion had created some kind of persistent disturbance in the atmosphere. I was struggling to maintain contact with the other ships when I heard something that made my hair stand on end. On one of the encrypted frequencies, barely audible through the static, storm generation exceeds all parameters. Ionospheric manipulation is working. Repeat, manipulation is working. Weather control protocols are now active. The curtain is stable. We can steer it. Weather control, ionospheric manipulation, we can steer it. The pieces were finally falling into place. Operation Argus wasn't about studying radiation belts or testing weapons effects. It was about learning to control the atmosphere itself, to create storms, to manipulate weather patterns, to build some kind of curtain in the upper atmosphere that could be directed and controlled. The storm lasted for 3 days, during which time normal communications were impossible. Ships in the task force lost visual contact with each other in the driving rain and towering seas. Several vessels reported compass malfunctions, electronics failures, and navigation problems that seemed to have no natural explanation. When the weather finally cleared on September 10th, the task force began the long journey home. But the journey was unlike anything I'd experienced in 8 years of naval service. For one thing, we encountered 3 more storms on the way back to Norfolk, sudden, violent weather systems that appeared with no warning and disappeared just as quickly. Each storm was accompanied by the same electromagnetic effects we'd experienced after the nuclear tests. Radio interference, compass problems, and that strange metallic ringing that seemed to come from the sky itself. For another, our navigation equipment kept giving us impossible readings. GPS wasn't available in 1958, but we had sophisticated radio navigation systems that could determine our position within a few miles. Except they kept telling us we were somewhere we couldn't possibly be. Sometimes hundreds of miles off course, sometimes at coordinates that placed us on dry land. "It's like the atmosphere is still disturbed from the tests," Chief Williams confided to me during one of the calmer periods. "Whatever we did up there, it's still affecting things down here." I'd been thinking the same thing. The nuclear explosions had created more than just pretty light shows and artificial radiation belts. They'd fundamentally altered something about the Earth's atmospheric system, something that was still affecting weather patterns, electromagnetic fields and navigation systems weeks later. As we approached Norfolk in early October, I started hearing rumours about what was happening back home. According to the Scuttlebutt network, there had been unusual weather all along the East Coast, sudden storms, unexpected temperature changes, aurora sightings as far south as North Carolina. Coincidence? After everything I'd witnessed in the South Atlantic, I wasn't buying it. Chapter 3. The official science didn't add up. The debriefing process began before we even docked at Norfolk. Intelligence officers came aboard while we were still in the harbour, separating crew members for individual interviews and collecting all recorded materials. They took my radio logs, my personal notes, even the unofficial recordings I'd made during the tests. But they missed something. Hidden in my footlocker, wrapped inside a spare uniform, was a small reel of magnetic tape that I'd palmed during one of the recording sessions. It contained about 30 minutes of the encrypted communications I'd intercepted during the tests, conversations between scientists and controllers that weren't supposed to exist. The official debriefing was conducted by a team of Navy intelligence officers and civilian scientists. They sat us down in groups of 5 or 6 and walked us through the same questions. What did you observe during the tests? Did you notice any unusual phenomena? Did you hear any unauthorized communications? Did you discuss the mission with anyone outside your assigned duties? The answers they wanted were clear. We observed nuclear tests. We noticed bright lights and some radio interference. We heard only official communications, and we kept our mouths shut about everything. But some of us had seen more than they wanted us to remember. Petty Officer Jenkins was in the same debriefing group as me, and when they asked him about unusual phenomena, he mentioned the impossible aurora displays we'd witnessed. Auroras are a normal result of high-altitude nuclear detonations, one of the scientists explained patiently. The charged particles from the explosion interact with the Earth's magnetic field to produce visible light phenomena. Nothing unusual about it. "But sir," Jenkins persisted, "we could see them all the way from South Africa to Argentina. I thought auroras only happened near the poles." The scientist's expression didn't change, but I caught a quick glance between him and one of the intelligence officers. The scale of the phenomena was somewhat larger than predicted, he admitted. But that's why we conduct tests, to gather data and refine our models. The important thing is that everything functioned within acceptable parameters. Acceptable parameters. That seemed to be the phrase they used whenever someone asked about something that didn't match the official story. When it was my turn for individual questioning, they focused heavily on my radio intercepts. They had my official logs, of course, but they wanted to know if I'd heard anything else. "Radioman Morrison, you monitored multiple frequencies during the operation. Did you intercept any communications that weren't on your assigned list?" I thought about the tape hidden in my footlocker, about the conversations I'd overheard regarding curtain parameters and ionospheric manipulation. "Just the usual chatter, sir. Ships talking to each other, weather reports, navigation updates, nothing unusual." "Did you hear any references to projects or operations other than Argus?" "No, sir." "Any discussion of weather control, atmospheric modification, or experimental technologies?" The question was so specific that it confirmed my suspicions, but I kept my expression neutral. "No, sir. Just standard nuclear test communications." They asked a few more questions, then dismissed me with the usual warnings about classification and the consequences of discussing the mission with unauthorized personnel. But as I left the debriefing room, I noticed something. They were asking everyone the same specific questions about weather control and atmospheric modification. That meant other people had heard the same things I had, and that meant the official story was definitely incomplete. Over the next few days, as we prepared for reassignment to other duties, I started quietly comparing notes with other crew members. Not directly, that would have violated security protocols, but through casual conversations and carefully phrased questions. What I learned was disturbing. Seaman Rodriguez, who worked in the ship's weather station, had recorded barometric pressure changes that didn't match any known meteorological patterns. The pressure had dropped and risen in precise cycles during each nuclear test, as if the explosions were creating artificial weather systems. Petty Officer Thompson, an electronics technician, had documented electromagnetic interference that extended far beyond what nuclear detonation should produce. His equipment had detected structured signals hidden in the static, patterns that looked almost like code. Chief Electrician Walsh had noticed that the ship's compass behaved strangely after each test, pointing to magnetic north one moment and swinging wildly the next, as if something was actively interfering with the Earth's magnetic field. None of this matched the official explanation that we'd been conducting simple radiation belt experiments. The scientists had told us we were studying the natural behaviour of charged particles in the upper atmosphere. But charged particles don't create artificial weather systems. They don't generate structured electromagnetic signals. They don't manipulate magnetic fields in predictable patterns, unless the particles weren't the point, unless the real purpose of the tests was to learn how to control those phenomena deliberately. I started thinking about the timing of Operation Argus. Why September 1958? Why had both the United States and Soviet Union suddenly decided to conduct identical experiments at the same time? The answer came to me while I was cleaning out my footlocker before leaving Norfolk. Among my personal papers, I found a newspaper clipping I'd saved from earlier that year. An article about International Geophysical Year, a global scientific cooperation effort that was supposed to study Earth's atmosphere, oceans and magnetic field. The article mentioned that 1958 was expected to be a year of maximum solar activity, with increased sunspot activity and stronger interactions between solar radiation and Earth's magnetic field. It was, the scientists said, an ideal time to study natural atmospheric phenomena, or an ideal time to test artificial ones. If you wanted to learn how to manipulate the atmosphere, you'd want to do it during a period when natural atmospheric disturbances were at their peak. That way, any unusual phenomena you created could be attributed to natural causes. Solar activity made perfect cover for weather control experiments, and if both superpowers were racing to develop atmospheric manipulation technology, they'd both want to conduct their tests during the same optimal window. 3 weeks after returning to Norfolk, I received my new assignment, communications duty at a listening post in Alaska. It was a remote assignment, the kind of place where a radio man could disappear for months without anyone noticing. The kind of place where someone who might have seen too much could be quietly isolated. But before I reported for duty, I did something that probably wasn't very smart. I made a copy of that intercepted tape. I took it to a friend who worked at a civilian electronics shop in Norfolk, a former Navy radio man who knew how to keep his mouth shut. I told him it was a recording of my family back home, and asked him to make a duplicate copy for safekeeping. He did the work without asking questions, and I walked out with 2 identical reels of tape. One went back into my footlocker, hidden among my spare uniforms. The other I mailed to my sister in Ohio, with instructions to keep it safe and not to ask questions. That tape contained the only evidence I had of what had really happened during Operation Argus. Conversations between scientists and controllers that revealed the true purpose of the tests. References to curtain parameters, ionospheric manipulation, weather control protocols, and the repeated assurance that the curtain is stable. I didn't know what the curtain was, but I was starting to have some ideas. What if the nuclear tests weren't designed to create radiation belts, but to create a controllable layer of ionized particles in the upper atmosphere? A layer that could be manipulated to affect weather patterns, redirect electromagnetic signals, or even serve as some kind of planetary defense system. What if Operation Argus was the first successful test of technology that could turn the Earth's atmosphere into a weapon? The implications were staggering. If the United States had developed the ability to control weather patterns, we could create droughts in enemy territories, generate storms to disrupt military operations, or even manipulate the climate to affect agricultural production. But there was something else, something that bothered me even more than the military applications. During one of the intercepted conversations, I'd heard a scientist say, "If the containment field collapses," and "we can't risk tearing it." Tearing what? The atmosphere itself? The magnetic field? Some kind of natural barrier that protected Earth from cosmic radiation? What if Operation Argus wasn't just about learning to control the atmosphere? What if it was about learning to repair it? What if there was something out there? Solar radiation, cosmic rays, some kind of extraterrestrial threat that required an artificial atmospheric barrier to defend against? And what if the nuclear tests were designed to create and maintain that barrier? It would explain the secrecy, the rushed timeline, the competition with Soviet efforts. If both superpowers knew about some kind of threat from space, they'd both be racing to develop defensive countermeasures, and they'd both want to keep it secret from their own populations to avoid panic. I carried these thoughts with me to Alaska, where I spent the next 3 years monitoring radio communications in the Arctic. It was cold, isolated work, but it gave me time to think and to listen. And what I heard during those long Arctic nights convinced me that Operation Argus had been just the beginning. Chapter 4. The Weather Turns. My assignment in Alaska lasted from October 1958 to January 1962, and those 3.5 years taught me more about what we'd really accomplished during Operation Argus than all the official debriefings combined. The listening post was located at Ladd Air Force Base near Fairbanks, a remote installation that monitored Soviet communications and atmospheric phenomena. My job was to maintain radio contact with weather stations across the Arctic, track atmospheric disturbances, and report any unusual phenomena to higher headquarters. What I discovered was that unusual phenomena had become the norm since September 1958. The first indication came just 6 weeks after my arrival. I was monitoring routine weather reports from stations across Alaska and northern Canada when I started noticing patterns that didn't make meteorological sense. Storms were appearing in locations where storms shouldn't occur. Temperature variations were following patterns that seemed almost mathematical in their precision. And most significantly, these anomalous weather events were happening in cycles that corresponded exactly to phases of high solar activity. It was as if someone had learned how to use natural solar radiation as a trigger for artificial weather control. I started keeping unofficial records, logging the unusual reports alongside the official weather data. What I found was a consistent pattern of atmospheric manipulation occurring roughly every 10 to 14 days, the same interval at which high-energy particles from the sun would interact with Earth's magnetic field. But here's what really convinced me that Operation Argus had been about more than radiation belt studies. The weather manipulation was getting more sophisticated over time. In late 1958, the artificial storms were crude and obvious. Sudden pressure drops, unexpected wind patterns, electromagnetic disturbances that couldn't be explained by natural phenomena. But by 1960, the manipulations had become subtle and refined. Storms appeared and dissipated exactly where weather models predicted they should, but with intensities and duration that perfectly served military or economic purposes. Droughts ended precisely when agricultural markets needed relief. Storm systems diverted around military exercises with mathematical precision. Arctic weather patterns shifted to keep Soviet bomber routes closed during periods of international tension. It was weather warfare, and it was being conducted right above my head. The most convincing evidence came during the winter of 1960 to 61, when I intercepted communications that weren't supposed to exist. I was monitoring shortwave frequencies during a particularly intense aurora display when I picked up encrypted transmissions on a frequency that wasn't assigned to any known station. The encryption was sophisticated, but not sophisticated enough to completely hide the content from someone who knew what to listen for. Atmospheric modification sequence 7 is complete. Pressure gradient manipulation successful over target zone. Curtain integrity remains stable across all monitored sectors. Next activation cycle scheduled for solar maximum plus 6 hours. There was that word again, curtain. And now it was being discussed in terms of integrity and sectors, as if it was some kind of global system that required constant monitoring and maintenance. Over the following months, I intercepted dozens of similar transmissions. References to curtain maintenance, ionospheric coherence, and barrier harmonics became routine. It was clear that Operation Argus had created something permanent in the upper atmosphere, something that required ongoing management and control. But the most disturbing intercept came in March 1961, during a particularly violent geomagnetic storm that knocked out communications across half of Alaska. Solar penetration increasing in sectors 7 through 12. Curtain showing stress fractures along the Antarctic perimeter. Recommend immediate reinforcement before breach occurs. If the barrier fails, exposure levels will exceed survivable parameters. Exposure levels. Survivable parameters. They weren't just talking about weather control anymore. They were talking about planetary defense against something from space. Something that would be lethal if it reached the Earth's surface. Chapter 5. Things Buried, Things Forgotten. In January 1962, I received orders to report back to Norfolk for reassignment. My time in Alaska was over, and with it, my access to the communications that had revealed so much about the true nature of Operation Argus. But the government wasn't done with me yet. The debriefing at Norfolk was unlike anything I'd experienced before. Instead of Navy intelligence officers, I was interviewed by civilians who didn't identify their agency or affiliation. They knew everything about my service record, my communications intercepts, even my personal habits and associations. Radioman Morrison, the lead interviewer began. Your service in Alaska has been exemplary. You've maintained security protocols and demonstrated exceptional discretion in handling classified materials. I nodded, not sure where this was heading. However, we're aware that you may have been exposed to communications and phenomena that fall outside normal classification levels. Information that could be misinterpreted by those without proper context. Here it comes, I thought. We're prepared to offer you an early discharge with full benefits, an excellent service record, and placement assistance in civilian communications work. All we ask in return is your continued discretion regarding certain aspects of your recent assignment. They slid a document across the table, a discharge form that listed my service record as exemplary, and my final assignment as Arctic weather monitoring. No mention of Argus, no reference to atmospheric research, nothing that would connect me to nuclear testing or weather manipulation experiments. What if I refuse? I asked. The interviewer's expression didn't change. Then you'll complete your enlistment at a communication station in the middle of the Pacific, where you'll spend the next 6 years monitoring routine shipping traffic. Your service record will reflect a gradual decline in performance and reliability. Your security clearance will be revoked, and any attempts to discuss classified information will result in immediate court-martial. It wasn't really a choice. Sign the papers and disappear into civilian life, or spend the rest of my naval career in exile. I signed. But before I left Norfolk, I did something that would haunt me for the next 60 years. I retrieved the tape reel from my footlocker and listened to it one more time. The voices were still there, preserved on magnetic tape despite decades of storage. Scientists and controllers discussing weather manipulation, ionospheric barriers, and something called the curtain that had to be maintained at all costs. The reflectivity coefficients are holding steady. Barrier harmonics are within acceptable parameters. If we push harder, the curtain might hold indefinitely. But we can't risk tearing it. The exposure would be catastrophic. As I listened to those voices from 1958, I realized that I was holding evidence of the most significant technological achievement in human history, and the most terrifying. Operation Argus hadn't just been about testing nuclear weapons in space. It had been about creating an artificial atmospheric barrier to protect Earth from something deadly that was coming from beyond our planet. The nuclear explosions had ionized particles in the upper atmosphere to create a controllable shield, a curtain that could be manipulated to deflect cosmic radiation, solar storms, or perhaps something even worse. And judging from the continued references to maintenance and reinforcement, that barrier was still operating. I sealed the tape in a waterproof container and buried it in my backyard in Norfolk before reporting for discharge. I told myself I'd come back for it someday, when I was old enough that the government couldn't touch me anymore, and that day has finally come. Chapter 6. The Implications. I'm 84 years old now, and I've spent the last 60 years watching the sky and wondering what we really accomplished during those 3 September days in 1958. The official history books mention Operation Argus briefly, if at all. When they do, they describe it exactly as we were told: a scientific experiment to study artificial radiation belts and high-altitude nuclear effects. 3 small nuclear devices detonated in space. Some pretty auroras, interesting data collected, mission complete. But the official history doesn't explain why high-altitude nuclear testing was banned immediately after Argus. It doesn't explain why both superpowers agreed to the 1963 Limited Test Ban Treaty that specifically prohibited nuclear explosions above ground, underwater, or in space. And it doesn't explain why atmospheric research suddenly became one of the most heavily classified fields in science. What I think happened is this. Operation Argus proved that nuclear explosions in the upper atmosphere could create controllable ionospheric barriers. These barriers could manipulate weather patterns, redirect electromagnetic radiation, and potentially shield Earth from cosmic threats. But they also proved that the technology was incredibly dangerous. The intercepts I heard suggested that the barrier could be damaged or torn, with catastrophic consequences for life on Earth. Whatever the curtain was protecting us from, losing it would be lethal. So both superpowers agreed to stop testing, not because they were concerned about peace or environmental protection, but because they were afraid of breaking something they'd learned to depend on. Think about it. Since 1958, there have been no confirmed nuclear explosions above the atmosphere. Despite decades of nuclear proliferation, despite the development of increasingly sophisticated weapons, no nation has tested nuclear devices in space. That's not because of arms control treaties. Treaties get broken all the time. It's because everyone with nuclear capability knows what those tests really accomplished, and they're all afraid of damaging the system that Argus created. The weather manipulation I observed in Alaska was just a side effect. The real purpose of the ionospheric barrier was planetary defense, protection against cosmic radiation, solar storms, or potentially even extraterrestrial threats that we weren't being told about. And I think that barrier is still operating. Consider the evidence. Since 1958, Earth's climate has become increasingly chaotic and unpredictable. Weather patterns that held steady for centuries have shifted dramatically. Solar storms that should have caused widespread electromagnetic disasters have been mysteriously deflected or weakened. The government calls it climate change and blames it on industrial pollution. But what if the real cause is an artificial atmospheric system that's been operating for over 60 years? What if the curtain that was supposed to protect us is now affecting global weather patterns in ways its creators never anticipated? What if Operation Argus saved us from one threat by creating another? I've spent decades trying to piece together the complete picture from the fragments I observed. The timing of the tests during maximum solar activity, the competition with Soviet efforts, the immediate ban on high-altitude nuclear testing, the continued secrecy surrounding atmospheric research. It all points to the same conclusion. Humanity discovered a cosmic threat serious enough to require planetary-scale defensive measures. We developed the technology to protect ourselves, but at the cost of giving up control over our own atmosphere, and we did it all in secret because the truth would have caused global panic. Chapter 7. The Quiet Receipt. I retrieved the tape from my backyard in Norfolk 3 months ago after my wife passed away, and I decided it was time to tell this story. The metal container had corroded, but the tape inside was still intact, sealed in plastic and preserved by 60 years of Virginia clay. I had it digitized by a local electronics shop, the same shop where I'd had it copied in 1958, though obviously run by different people now. The young technician who did the work probably thought it was just old family recordings. If only he knew. The voices are still there, faint but audible. Scientists and controllers discussing ionospheric manipulation, weather control protocols, and the mysterious curtain that had to be maintained at all costs. Evidence of the most significant technological achievement in human history, and the most dangerous secret ever kept. I've listened to it dozens of times over the past few months, And every time I hear that one phrase that convinced me to finally speak out, if we push harder, the curtain might hold indefinitely, but we can't risk tearing it. 65 years later, we still don't know what would happen if the curtain tore. We don't know what it's protecting us from, how long it will last, or what the consequences might be if it fails. But I know this. Every time there's a major solar storm, every time the aurora displays extend further south than they should, every time the weather behaves in ways that don't match any natural pattern, I wonder if we're seeing signs that the barrier is weakening. The scientists who created it are long dead. The politicians who authorized it are gone. The military officers who supervised it have passed away. But the system they built is still operating somewhere above our heads, invisible and unacknowledged, protecting us from something we're not allowed to know about. Sometimes I think about releasing the tape, making it public, forcing the government to acknowledge what really happened during Operation Argus. But then I remember that phrase, we can't risk tearing it. What if the secrecy isn't just about covering up government experiments? What if it's about preventing panic that could somehow interfere with the barrier's operation? What if public knowledge of the system could somehow compromise its effectiveness? I don't know the answers to these questions. I'm just an old radio man who happened to be in the right place at the wrong time to witness something that was never meant to be seen. But I do know this. The official story of Operation Argus is a lie. We didn't just study radiation belts in September 1958. We built something. Something that's still protecting us, or controlling us, or both. The history books call it Operation Argus. We called it something else, the day we learned the sky could break. And somewhere above us, invisible and unacknowledged, the curtain still hangs between Earth and whatever lies beyond. Every night when I look up at the stars, I wonder how much longer it will hold. That's the story Frank Morrison told me before he passed away last month. I found this tape in his effects, along with instructions to share his account if anything happened to him. Whether you believe it or not is up to you. But the next time you see aurora displays where they shouldn't be, or weather patterns that don't make sense, or solar storms that mysteriously weaken before reaching Earth, remember Operation Argus, remember the curtain, and remember that some secrets are kept not to protect the government, but to protect all of us from truths we might not be ready to handle.